Well, good morning, everyone, or good evening, or or good afternoon, depending on where all our speakers are from, and where our attendees are. My name is Bruce Belzowski. I'm the Managing Director of the Automotive Futures Group, and I want to welcome you to our conference on the effects of the Biden administration policies on the U.S. automotive industry. As I said, I'm the managing director. My name is Bruce Belzowski. I'm retired from the University of Michigan Transportation Research Institute. You can reach me at bbl@umich.edu. The Automotive Futures Group is made up of our affiliate program, our research, and our conferences. 5 annual conferences, research focusing on globalization, powertrains, and intelligent transportation systems, including connected and autonomous vehicles. And most of our funding comes from our affiliate program. And we have both supporting members and research partners. We always like to thank our affiliates that they are the ones that allow us to put on the conferences that we do right now. This is our list of our current affiliates. And we're also pleased to soon welcome a new affiliate member, Siemens Digital Industries Software. Looking forward to working with them. Our research partners include IT organizations, OEMs, government NGOs, suppliers, consultants. Our research projects, the main ones that we're working on right now are propulsion strategies for the 21st century. Our new survey will probably late May, early June, and the results will be shown in our conference in July. Our China new energy vehicle, and also now a global EV project, where we're looking at the introduction of new energy vehicles. Here we're looking at battery electric vehicles, plug-in hybrids, and fuel cell vehicles. And also our work on new mobility, particularly our focus on our conference that usually takes place in February. We have a cast of thousands as part of our group, basically made up of student researchers. As you can see, they cross a lot of grades, as well as their focus on their interests within the university, data science, economics, psychology, computer science, engineering, and as well as our newest person is Kristen Toporski, who's a freshman working on media and communications. And our main researcher who's been working with us since the 1990s, Kara Alkire, she's online right now on the monitoring the YouTube site, as she'll be taking questions from the chat box if you want to enter them there. You can also follow us on LinkedIn. We're posting 2 to 3 times a week with research as well as information, sometimes a lot of it linked to our coming events, our speakers, as well as things that are going on that we think are important to the future of the auto industry. Upcoming conferences, as I said, in July 13th and 14th is our 14th annual propulsion strategies for the 21st century. And looking at some conference logistics. So here we're looking at, we have a good set of speakers representing manufacturers, suppliers, the environment, and labor today. Michael Hartrick is a Senior Director, Energy and Environment at the Alliance for Automotive Innovation. Mike Jackson is the Executive Director of Strategy and Research at the Original Equipment Supplier Association. Simon Wee is the Director of Clean Vehicles and Fuels at the Natural Resources Defense Council. And Robert Chiaravelli is the CEO of Strategic Labor and Human Resources Limited. I'm going to start out with my intro, then we'll have Michael speak, then Simon. After Michael's, we'll do a 10-minute Q&A. After Simon, a 10-minute Q&A, we'll take a 10-minute break, come back, and I'll talk a little bit about our recent research on of our expert survey of asking about people about the effects of Biden administration policies. Mike Jackson will follow me with a Q&A, and then Robert will end us today with his presentation and a Q&A, and then we'll be done around 12:30. We have a post-conference mailing. All the attendees will get a link to the presentations. Affiliates get the presentations sent to all the company representatives in our database, as well as a document and a link to review the highlights of the conference. We'll also be posting things that come out of the conference on our LinkedIn site. So the agenda, speaker bios, registration lists, sponsorship opportunities, affiliate information, and upcoming events are all on the website. The link to that website is right underneath the YouTube video that you're looking at right now. But it's also sent to you via email yesterday, and I actually resent it this morning to make sure everybody got it. There's audience questions. If you have a question you want to ask, you can put it in the chat. Kara will be catching those and sending those to me. There's also a link that I sent you in the email, but also underneath the YouTube video that has a link to a Google form to enter questions there if you want to make those questions a little more private. So looking at Biden administration policies, there's a lot to talk about, but I'm going to just give a quick overview of some of the things that we've been looking at. And our speakers, I'm sure, will touch on a lot of these as well, and in probably more detail, and also how they see those affecting the groups that they're representing. So when you look at the administration, a lot of it in relation to the automotive industry has to do with climate change goals. And as you can see, the focus is reduction not only just to EVs charged on the grid, but making the grid sustainable and making it renewable. And that's one of the goals that we see here, and probably going on into the future because of climate change. What we see from the Environmental Protection Agency, again, these are really focused on what we're seeing in the auto industry. In December, they finalized their federal greenhouse gas emissions standards for passenger cars and light trucks for model years 2023 through 26. In March of this year, they announced winners to the two school bus rebate opportunities, moving school buses away from diesel to electrics, or maybe propane and other natural gas. In March of this year, the EPA reinstated California's authority under the Clean Air Act to implement their own greenhouse gas emission standards and zero emission ZEV sales mandates. I think our speakers are going to be speaking about this as well. And finally, most recently, they announced $5.4 million in grant funding. It's expected to be awarded to tribal and insular areas to establish low emission diesel projects. From the National Highway Transportation Traffic and Safety Administration, underneath the Department of Transportation, recently in March, they issued a first of its kind final rule to ensure safety of occupants in automated vehicles. A very interesting thing that we've been looking at and kind of waiting for from the government for a while. There's still a lot more work to do about automated vehicles and safety. Most recently, NHTSA finally finalized and revised the revised fuel economy standards for passenger cars and light trucks for model years 2024 to 25. That increased at a rate of 8% per year and increased at a rate of 10% per year for model year 2026. Very challenging for the manufacturers and the supply base, and we'll want to talk about this. When you look at the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, there's two pieces of this. The pre-allotted funding is $650 million, and new spending is $550 million. Out of that 550, 284 is for surface transportation, and 266 is for core infrastructure. When we look at it, we look at better roads and bridges from an auto perspective, upgrading the power infrastructure for the introduction of electric vehicles, the network of electric vehicle chargers, again, connected to the auto industry. And for high-speed internet access, I circled this here because my colleagues over at the U of M Transportation Research Institute have been talking about the potential use of 5G for connected vehicles, for vehicles to talk to each other and to talk to infrastructure. They're not quite convinced that 5G is actually going to do the trick compared to DSRC, but it's something that if high-speed internet access, especially 5G, is prevalent throughout the U.S., there would definitely be cases where they might be able to take advantage of it. From the new investment for the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, you can see that most of it goes to highways, then to rail, then to power and grid, then to broadband and other areas. Notice that EV charging is down towards the bottom at $7.5 billion. As you can imagine, in a bill as large as the infrastructure bill, it crosses many agencies, and we're actually seeing more interaction among the agencies. But you see most of the money is going to DOT, then EPA, DOE, and others, groups within the federal government. Within DOT, there's monies that is $90 billion that's going to fund the highways and through the Highway Trust Fund. 90 billion for the highways and 28 billion for transit. They did this because the trust fund is heading towards an insolvency by 2031, and so they're going to support the Highway Trust Fund as part of this bill. One of the main ways that the number one way that the trust fund is funded is through gas taxes. And as vehicles become more fuel efficient, and also they also become electrified, there's less money that is actually collected that goes into the trust fund. And so both the federal government and state governments are going to have to deal with this and in the near term. From the DOE, you're looking at areas for grid and renewable energy, carbon capture and storage. I thought that carbon capture was a dead letter a number of years ago, but it looks like it has new life. Hydrogen, nuclear, EVs and batteries, building efficiency industry, and one of the main things that we're starting to talk about more now, critical minerals and rare earths within the U.S. for the introduction of electric vehicles. When you break out some of the DOE funding, $7 billion to supply chain for batteries, producing critical materials, sourcing materials for manufacturing, and even recycling critical materials without new extraction and mining, which it sounds like is something that's more into the future. In the near term, there's definitely going to have to be some mining. And one of the things that you see as part of the title of this of the act is that it's an Investment and Jobs Act. And there's so many things that we're talking about within these acts, within this law, that is related to jobs. And so it's something that we probably really shouldn't ignore in terms of what it's going to mean for people within the U.S. 1.5 billion for hydrogen, 750 billion for grant programs for coal communities. Here you're looking at communities that are transferring from coal to other other forms of technology. Now, this may apply not only to West Virginia, but it also applies to a lot of the tribal nations that have been really focused on coal for many years. The expansion of the authority of the DOE's loan program to invest in projects that increase domestic supply of critical minerals. Again, these are mining issues as well as discovery issues, and then getting the processing of materials from the mines before it gets put into the supply chain. From the DOE, looking at the power infrastructure, there's funds to upgrade with new transmission lines to facilitate renewable energy, and also monies for clean energy technologies. There's a new joint office of transportation and energy. One of the areas that they're working on together is the charging infrastructure. There's also as I said, the electrification of school and transit buses. This is EPA as well as DOE and DOT. And you look at where we are now in terms of EV chargers. I was really surprised when I saw this graph because I was really expecting more private chargers than public chargers, because most of the people who can afford the electric vehicles that are on sale and have been on sale for the last few years in the US usually probably charge at home. But it doesn't mean that you would think that you would be counting them as private chargers, and that they'd be counting more than what we're seeing here. But when you look at some of the stories that they're talking about, is the U.S. is farther behind. We saw some numbers that said the Chinese now have 200,000 public chargers, and our research on what we've been following in China is that there are over 1 million chargers, public chargers, and when you combine that with private chargers, you're looking at close to 2 million chargers in China right now. Okay, also the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Formula Program. Here you're looking at this chargers that are going to be put along the interstate system. You're looking at monies that is going to be available to the states. The states are based on their size, and so they are getting they have opportunities to use this money for investment in the electric vehicle formula program. Now they have to show that they have plans, not only that they're well-developed plans to be able to get the monies. We're looking at a 2.5 discretionary grant program, and also 1.2 billion, 25 billion grant for the charger development. One set of these is going into rural charging, building resilient infrastructure, increasing charging access to underserved and overburdened communities. And the funds, as you can see here, the acquisition installation of EV charging, it has to serve as a catalyst for the deployment of such infrastructure. So they really see this money as a starting point for states to be able to use the money to develop new charging infrastructure besides what the government is paying for. It also requires the proper operation and maintenance of EV charging infrastructure. And one of the newer things that we see in government is data sharing about EV charging infrastructure to ensure the long-term success of the investments. And as we get towards the end here, it's interesting to look at the title of this graph, where you have the breakdown of the Build Back Better Act. Well, it really has broken down. So there is no Build Back Better Act, but it shows you that there was a lot of money that was set aside within that act for clean energy and climate investments. And where one could argue that this is the missing piece for the auto industry, because it was focusing on tax incentives for new personal vehicles and used vehicles. and commercial vehicles, and refueling infrastructure, and assistance in retooling manufacturing facilities. So there was a lot of money here available that was going to be available to the industry and to consumers to help with the transition to fuel cell and electric vehicles. Now, this is not completely dead. It looks like they're going to pull apart pieces of this program. So we'll see if this works and if they'll be able to do this in the short term. We've seen the Defense Production Act to encourage domestic production of minerals to make batteries for electric vehicles. And this is supposed to help companies receive government funding for feasibility studies or projects that extract materials, including lithium, nickel, cobalt, graphite, and manganese, and supply chain resilience. There's no legislation on this, but lots of discussions with industry, especially semiconductor companies, about reshoring and new production facilities. So that's all I have to share with you guys today. As I said earlier, the link to the presentations will be emailed this weekend for everybody who are registered for the conference. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our first speaker, Michael Hartrick from the Alliance of Automotive Innovation. Michael, you're getting your stuff ready. There you go. Very good. Mike joined the Alliance for Automotive Innovation at its inception, coming from the Alliance of Automobile Manufacturers, which he joined in 2016. Mike covers greenhouse gas and fuel economy regulations and vehicle certification issues. He brings over 20 years of automotive experience to auto innovators, including 16 plus years at FCA and its many predecessors. Mike also has experience in vehicle emission and powertrain testing and emission control system defect investigation. He holds a Bachelor of Science degree in chemical engineering from Michigan Tech University. Michael, welcome.
Thank you, Bruce, for having me here today. And as Bruce said, I'm a little bit of a policy wonk in the greenhouse gas and CAFE space, so I think I'll take you through that particular area in more depth than Bruce did earlier today. So, Bruce, thank you for not taking all of my slides from me. Appreciate that today.
I try, Mike. I try.
Yeah. So. Title of my presentation today is Charging Towards EVs, the Biden GHG CAFE and related policy actions. So I think that gives you an idea of where I'm headed here. So a bit of a brief word about my organization before we get going. We call ourselves Auto Innovators or the Alliance for Automotive Innovation. Our members are many of the manufacturers of automobiles in the United States, about 98% by sales, plus supplier, value chain companies, and technology companies. So you see we have a pretty broad swath of people that I try to represent, and that they tell me many different things. So it's not always a straightforward process, but we do have some positions on fuel economy and greenhouse gas regulations, and I hope I can share with you where we stand on everything as it goes forward here. So my perspective for today, I tried to break this down in my own mind into a couple key areas, I guess, in terms of Biden policies. One is near-term regulatory actions for GHG and fuel economy. The second would be the late decade policy goals and regulatory actions that are expected to impact the auto industry through 2030 and beyond. And then third, which Bruce has covered in fairly good detail, or at least probably more detail than I was intending to cover today. So again, thank you, Bruce. Supporting actions and efforts from the Biden administration to try to help make these things happen for the U.S. auto industry. So I'll give you a quick spoiler alert. So shut off your ears if you don't want to know the answer right now, but it kind of boils down to more electric vehicles and then rapid market infrastructure and supply chain development being critical to getting to these goals of the administration. So I don't think that's a surprise for anybody here today, but if you were wondering what the answer was, there it is. So first of all, near-term regulatory actions. We would say that the EPA, GHG, and CAFE standards are both challenging and aggressive. We do support the GHG standards as they are enacted, and don't want to see that change by several of the lawsuits. So I'll get that out of the way and then say that I probably can't comment any more on lawsuits. So please don't ask any questions in that area, Bruce. But we do support the final GHG standards as they are in their current form. So what are those standards? And here I've tried to plot out a comparison of both the standards themselves in red, the solid red, what was proposed in the dashed red. Now, what were the standards as of the Trump administration in gray? And then just for reference, where do manufacturers stand as of model year 2021? And of course, model year 2021 data is still being, the manufacturers are still finishing compiling that. So if I talk about anything in 2021, it's generally from a advanced study that we have IHS Markit do for us based on input from those from our manufacturers to try to assess where the industry is likely to land before that data becomes available. So bottom line, manufacturers are in 2021 are expected to be at about 237 grams per mile of CO2 emissions, or 37.5 miles per gallon. The proposed rule from the Biden administration originally intended I should just say the proposed rule discussed standards that would have gotten manufacturers to about 179 grams per mile if nothing changes from today's fleet, the 2021 fleet, that is. And then the final standards actually jumped to 166 grams per mile, or about 53.5 miles per gallon. So there's a number of flexibilities here. There are things in here that are intended to help encourage electric vehicles. There's some limited multipliers in 2023 and 2024, which will shift the performance line, or the compliance line, maybe I should say, a little bit more towards the good. And then the manufacturers will have to reset after that point and continue on their pathway to 2026 without such multipliers. There's also some other limited flexibility changes in the rule that I'm not going to dwell on in today. But what I'd like to take away from this slide is that the average vehicle has to improve 29% over the next 5 years if we start from model year 2021. And that 29%, I don't know what your perspective is as members of this audience, but 29% is not a small number. That's every bit of shifting the entire fleet either to strong hybrids or mixing in various ICE improvements plus jumping to stronger electrification levels to get to that sort of improvement level, excuse me. So 29% is about 7% per year on a compounded average basis. And I'll just note that the US industry hasn't improved fuel economy of the fleet more than about 2% per year for the past decade, even though it seems like we're moving very fast and people are adding a lot of technologies to vehicles. On a fleet average basis, even when new vehicles when they're redesigned, coming in at 10 to 15% improvement levels, the fleet average itself moves at a much slower rate because we're just not redesigning vehicles every year. There's just not enough money or engineering resources to make that happen. So 29% is a large leap forward. And I think that's part of the reason why we're seeing manufacturers moving into the strong electrification space faster and faster, because you need these revolutionary changes in technology in order to keep up with the standards at this point. Similarly, we have new CAFE regulations for 2024 through 2026. I would assess that they're probably similar in stringency to the EPA standards, but there are some statutory differences that will make CAFE compliance probably more difficult than even GHG compliances. Namely, there's some differences in how electric vehicles are treated. And there's also some limitations and some of the flexibilities that just make shifting credits between car and truck fleets and where you're earning credits or not a little bit more difficult, and some additional minimum standards for domestic cars, which may influence decisions in the future about where electric vehicles are being made. Similar to the GHG program, the average vehicle must improve about 28% over its 2021 CAFE performance level. I'm doing this calculation of fuel consumption, not economy, if you're back checking my math. And again, some limited flexibilities and incentives for electric vehicles, which will help in terms of compliance, but still a very challenging rule here. Bruce mentioned that the EPA recently restored California's waiver for its zero emission vehicle mandate and its greenhouse gas rules. So I thought it'd be good to touch on this at least momentarily. And what I'm showing here on your left-hand side is a graphic of the standards, again, based on model year 2021 fleet, based on US fleet averages even, which are probably relatively similar to what California plus the states that have adopted California regulations have in terms of fleet mix, but individual manufacturers will obviously vary depending on where they sell cars and what sorts of cars they sell in these states. So in gray is the EPA standard just for comparability purposes. In solid red is the actual California standard. And then in the dashed red is what we call the framework agreements that California has signed with 5 manufacturers that previously committed to meeting stronger standards on a national level when the Trump administration had reduced the stringency of the national level standards. I'll mention that these framework agreements have a number of flexibilities built into them that will help those companies with compliance, including some starting credit banks, larger EV multipliers than the EPA program, and other enhanced flexibilities. The non-framework agreement manufacturers that will have to meet the solid red line don't have any starting credit banks, and they don't have any EV multipliers, and they have to account for upstream electricity emissions when complying with this program. So both of these sets of manufacturers will probably end up being meeting standards that are more stringent in 2021 and 2022 than the EPA federal rule. And that's primarily because EPA's new rule only started to take effect in 2023. You can see in the gray there that large decrease in allowable emissions in 2023. So you may be wondering, well, what does that really mean? First of all, it means that manufacturers are again subject to 3 different sets of standards and have to meet each of those individually with their own quirks in the standards, if you will. And of course, if they have a compliance problem, they're probably going to have problems in all 3, and they're of course held to penalties and other regulatory prohibitions on 3 different standards for the same sort of impacts here. So I look at 21 and 2022, and my biggest concern on the behalf of the manufacturers, and every manufacturer will be different, is, well, how do you make that big jump down? If we were still above standard, if I flip back here for a second, my blue line here, if we were above the EPA standard in 2021 and the California standard is that much more difficult, that's a big challenge here in the next couple of years. There is some additional credit carryback, they call it, from later years. So maybe something in this range in 2026 may be brought back to 21, 22. Otherwise, I think manufacturers will be looking for credits and trying to figure out how to comply in that space. And that's about all I can say there, not knowing exactly what their plans are. So bottom line, standards will continue to drive additional industry investments in all technology options, particularly electrification. So I've said it a couple of times now. Let's take a little bit deeper dive in that particular area. So here are some technology projections from EPA and NHTSA. I pulled these out of their final rules. Whenever EPA and NHTSA create fuel economy or greenhouse gas regulations, they do a technology modeling effort and try to assess what are cost-effective technologies that meet the standards that they're proposing, what are cost-effective technologies that meet other regulatory options. So these represent the final rules. And in the case of the CAFE standards, which I'm showing in orange here, um, I pulled these out of what NHTSA would call their unconstrained analysis or their environmental impact standards analysis. So this removes some of the constraints that they put in the models to meet some statutory requirements, and is in theory supposed to be representing a more real world view, if you will. On the left here, EVs as a whole, battery electric vehicles, plug-in hybrids, and fuel cell electric vehicles. And I guess I'll leave a side note here that that the battery electric vehicles make up the large bulk of these plug-in hybrids and fuel cell electric vehicles, and both the EPA and NHTSA analyses are much smaller portions of these overall bars. So although I'm saying it's all electric vehicles combined, you can probably think about these bars or columns as largely derived from projected battery electric vehicle market increases. So in the case of EPA, EPA is projecting that we go from about 2% market share in 2020 and increasing that about by 7 times or 700%, if you will, over the next 6 years to 2026. So a big growth curve there. I can't say it's completely out of line with what we're seeing in the market, but it's still going to be a large challenge to get there. And I'll talk a little bit more about that momentarily. I also thought it would be interesting to show strong hybrids. Well, let me stop there for a moment and go back for one other comment here. Orange versus blue bars here on the left-hand side. Battery electric vehicles in the NHTSA analysis are generally much lower penetration rates, and that's largely driven in the modeling by differences in the two agencies' assessment of battery costs. So maybe the way to think about this is if battery costs come in on the less expensive side, then electric vehicles are more able to satisfy these greenhouse gas requirements and maybe are more accepted by consumers. It's similarly in the modeling, if maybe you're more pessimistic about battery costs, the market for electric vehicles it's a much tougher one to increase from a sales standpoint. On the right here, I've plotted strong hybrids. I thought it'd be interesting to see, well, it's not fully plug-in electrification. You know, what other, I'm going to use it as a surrogate for other technologies, if you will. So how much more ICE type work is also necessary under these rules, even if we get 17 or 20% battery electric vehicles. And even within the agency's analysis, that's a 4 times increase in the strong hybrids also. So I don't want to oversell technology projections. Any projection is at risk. You know, there's a ton of information that goes into these battery prices, fuel prices, what are consumers willing to pay for technology, what is the price elasticity, you know, are there other drawbacks to technology? So any projection is probably going to be wrong to some extent. But this gives you a sense of where the agencies think the industry has to head to meet the standards that I was just talking about. So I thought it'd be interesting to look at, well, what are third parties saying about technology projections? And I pulled this graphic from a IHS market study of automotive regulatory credit trading that was published earlier this year. And what was kind of remarkable to me when I started looking at this, I don't know if I would, you know, put too much weight on you know, longer term projections here, but in terms of projections through 2026, I thought it was remarkable how similar the IHS market projection is to the agency's projections for electrification. So I was just talking about roughly 17% battery electric vehicles in the EPA assessment. IHS market says that the technology mix will probably be about 22% electric vehicles, and agrees that battery electric vehicles are probably going to make up the strongest portion of that. And similarly, that there's still going to have to be another 12% strong hybrids by 2026. So IHS approaches this in a little bit different fashion, and I'm not an IHS expert and I'm not speaking for IHS, so I can't say exactly everything that goes into these projections, but my understanding is that they are also looking at manufacturer announcements and plant openings and things like that. And part of this report suggests that if the manufacturers are able to follow this technology mix projection, that they will become roughly compliant with the GHG regulations by about model year 2023. And it's not perfect. Compliance performance versus standards always varies a little bit above and below based on who's doing what. And of course, every individual manufacturer is different. Tesla, obviously, as an example, would be 100% battery electric vehicles, and a company that has relatively efficient ICE engines for the time being may be much lower in terms of electrification. So don't treat this as representative of any particular manufacturer, but maybe as directionally where the industry is going. So that brings me to later decade policy goals and regulatory actions that are going on. And the first is President Biden's Executive Order 14037, strengthening American leadership in clean cars and trucks. The second is California's Advanced Clean Cars 2 regulations and what they've recently proposed, and that will be considered by their board in June of this year. And others, I would say that there's the Biden administration goals that they've talked about of 50 to 52% GHG reduction by 2030, and the rejoining of the Paris Agreement by the United States. So Executive Order 14037 talks about new GHG and CAFE rules through at least model year 2030. That doesn't mean that the agencies can't go farther than that. That just gives the agencies a bit of a roadmap that the administration would like to see rules set for at least another 4 years in the next round of rulemaking. That executive order also talks about a goal of the United States reaching 50% electric vehicle sales on a market share basis for new vehicle sales by 2030. And in their press releases on this executive order, the White House also talked about a 60% GHG reduction being expected relative to 2020 levels. So I did a little bit of math here. What does 60% mean? And that ends up being about a 94 gram per mile standard, or maybe in terms that are better understood, a 95 mile per gallon CAFE standard type level, which is pretty large until you start considering that the fuel economy of electric vehicles is pretty high. So again, another large driver towards electrification. Also in this executive order, they call them multi-pollutant standards, but what we would read into that is both greenhouse gas standards and traditional criteria pollutant standards like hydrocarbons, nitrogen oxides, things of that nature. So additional pressure on the existing ICEs in the fleet and the remaining ICEs in the fleet as we transition towards electrification. EPA does expect to issue a proposal by March of 2023. They discussed that earlier this year at the SAE Government Industry Conference, and that they would expect to publish, and the executive order lays out a roadmap that the final rules have to be published no later than July of 2024. So on the left here, again, not trying to make this sound negative, but we need to get to 21 times increase in electric vehicle sales over the next 10 years to meet that 50% level. Or if we take the EPA projection of roughly 17% EV sales by 2026, that's still another threefold increase over 4 years by 2030. So let's talk a little bit about the California greenhouse gas and ZEV waiver and what California is proposing in terms of their ZEV mandate. So the ZEV mandate would be enforced by California for sure. And then there's another number of states that represent collectively about 35% of the US market that have adopted or are in the process of adopting California's ZEV regulations. These states, all make their own decisions and will have to adopt these new rules. But what these new rules are proposed to do is to get to manufacturers in these states to 35% electric sales by 2026. So significantly higher than what we're talking about in the US as a whole. 70% roughly by 2030. So I'll call it about 2 years in advance of what the Biden administration executive order is discussing, and 100% electric vehicle sales in these states by 2035. Just in comparison, California is roughly 14% electric vehicle sales as of calendar year 2021, and the US as a whole is approximately 4% sales, electric vehicle sales in 2021. So I wanted to kind of start thinking about this in terms of market, and I used a standard Rogers adoption technology diffusion curve, if you will, although I would say in the case of the ZEV mandate and greenhouse gas rules, when we start talking about regulatory drivers, you know, the standard technology diffusion curve probably doesn't apply. We'll probably will not have this somewhat normal shape. You know, we'll probably end up with a much steeper slope and maybe even a much shorter tail on the right-hand side here. But for the purposes of today, I think it lays out kind of a conceptually, where do we stand in the market today and what we need to do here. So in 2021, we're probably in roughly the early adopter stage for electric vehicles. So there's a lot of really good news coming out lately that electric vehicle sales are increasing. They're increasing rapidly. That's all good. You know, there's a lot of news that on chargers, you know, people are developing charging infrastructure. That's good. I'm not here to say that, you know, I don't want to be a negative person here, but I do want to note that we are still very much so in the early adopter stage of the market, where people are just starting to figure out what does an electric vehicle need to look like and do in order to reach a greater majority of the market. By 2026, these standards are probably going to drive us into the early majority phase of the market. And these are still people that are probably tending already towards thinking about buying electric vehicles. And then by 2030, we'll probably have to be all the way through the early majority phase and starting to enter the late majority phase. So we're no longer talking about technology development, although technology development will still be critical. We'll still need to figure out what is our pathway to reducing battery prices and bringing down the cost of electric vehicles. You know, we'll still have to be figuring out, you know, our electric grids. How do all these electric vehicles fit in with the electric grid? What has to happen in the grid to make sure that these electric vehicles are supported? So there's still a lot of things to be figured out here, but we need to be moving through this market very rapidly to meet these regulations. And by 2035 in California, essentially we've moved all the way through the laggard phase. So again, you know, as we start looking at future regulations, in our minds, we're starting to think about, okay, this isn't necessarily about technology feasibility anymore. This is also about market feasibility. You know, what do these vehicles have to do to get to 75%, you know, to 100% of our customers? You know, what will those, you know, those later people need in the vehicles? You know, the same thing applies in infrastructure development. You know, early on right now, it's, you know, we're talking about customers today, you know, are pretty much at the high end or costlier end of the automotive market. These are people that generally have attached garages and they have places to park every night, and they can you know, they can afford to install charging infrastructure in their homes. You know, what do we need? How do we get to those people that don't have those same things? They have a 1,000-foot dirt driveway and they park out in their driveway when they get home next to their barn. You know, how do we get to all the customers that are living in apartments and other multi-unit dwellings? I think these are all really important questions going into the future. I found it really interesting when Bruce was talking earlier about his about the students in the Automotive Futures program, and I looked at their majors, and we saw everything from engineers to marketing, people that are interested in marketing, and we saw people, the Internet of Everything. And all those things are going to be really critical going into the future as we try to literally transform this industry from over 100 years of internal combustion engine technology type thinking and into the future of what is necessary in the battery electric and plug-in hybrid electric world. Check my time here real quick. So I have about 5 minutes to wrap up here. So just a quick note on transaction prices. I mentioned that we're currently kind of at the top end of the market. You can see electric vehicles, average transaction prices are in the $63,000 range. And my understanding is that if we looked at more recent data, we'd move even higher. So right now, manufacturers are focused on the luxury car segments. They're focused on larger vehicles with larger profit margins, generally speaking. And if we're have a hope of getting to the mainstream market, we need to bring these prices down somehow, and we need to start putting more vehicles into these lower cost segments. And you see that happening with some manufacturers already. Recent announcements, for example, from Honda and GM, where they talk about building $30,000 or so SUVs, small SUVs, and things of that nature. So those things are going to be necessary. But again, we have a lot of news about the rapidly expanding electric vehicle sales, and we're essentially pulling the cream off the top of the milk right now. And we need to figure out how to get the rest of the market into that space also. So we need a range of supportive policies and other tools in place to accelerate this shift to electric vehicles and to enhance American competitiveness. Those include infrastructure actions. That infrastructure needs to be everywhere. It needs to be convenient. We need to start addressing, the rejection reasons with people saying, hey, I don't have a place to charge. As manufacturers and the government, we need to find ways to get these vehicles, the cost of these vehicles down. Some of that can be incentives to help bridge those gaps today. Incentives also bring attention to these vehicles. And when, it's no different than years of automotive marketing. When you want to sell a vehicle, you throw thousands of dollars on the hood, and all of a sudden people show up at the dealerships. And I'm not saying that's great for business, but these are the sorts of things that are attracting attention to these vehicles. So we need to keep working on costs. On the production side, we have billions of dollars, hundreds of billions of dollars going in for manufacturers to develop new production facilities, battery manufacturing facilities, et cetera. That's just the starting line. We're also trying to build essentially a supply chain from scratch. Right now we're heavily dependent on China for critical minerals, Russia in the case of nickel, and we see prices spiking today. And battery costs, that were $130 per kilowatt hour only a few months ago are now in the $160 per kilowatt hour type range. And again, customers are going to be really critical. How do we get buy-in from all new vehicle purchasers? And then when they go to sell those new vehicles, or what were new vehicles, into the used market, how do you make them things that the used market can accept and want to buy? So that brings me to kind of my final point here on Biden's supporting stuff, and I think Bruce covered this well, so I will stop and not go into too much detail. But we did have the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, the $7.5 billion for National Charging Network. Great, that's a good down payment to starting to get to where we need. But I think Bruce mentioned it. We've got to get a lot more out there, and this is just the beginning. Coming back from recess, Congress is probably going to focus on reconciliation of various semiconductor bills, so that will help us, maybe in several years when those plants get built, hopefully. And then there's other supporting elements that, as Bruce mentioned, Build Back Better is kind of fallen apart, but the administration is still interested in incentives, infrastructure, and domestic supply chain, and continues to make efforts to help out there, but it's hard. So what I would say is regulation has been the easy part of policy, at least from a government perspective, not necessarily from our perspective. But now the harder work comes. We need to figure out how to get all of these supporting elements in place at the same time as the vehicles are coming out into the market. It all has to happen together. It's not a chicken and egg. We both have to happen at the same time. So I'll close my talk today with a statement that we made several months ago when the greenhouse gas rules were first proposed, that with the right complementary policies in place, the auto industry is poised to accept the challenge of driving EV purchases to between 40 and 50% of new vehicle sales by the end of the decade. And with that, thank you for your time. Appreciate it. And you can find a lot more detail on our website at the Alliance for Automotive Innovation. Thanks.
Well, overall, Mike, you paint a picture of lots of challenges.
I think that's accurate, Bruce.
Lots of challenges here. One of the things that I wanted to touch on with you to see if how you feel about it is the technology actually ready? Is EV technology actually ready? Are you convinced? And from your manufacturer perspectives, are you convinced? Are they convinced that the technology is ready?
I would say that I don't think I've heard from a single manufacturer any concern about the technology, so to speak. Are batteries durable enough? Are will they last the life of the vehicles? Things of that nature don't seem to be a concern from a manufacturer perspective. Where there is still concern is the costs. And I think you see a lot of battery manufacturers and the automobile manufacturers themselves too investing in a lot of research, trying to find pathways to improve battery systems. Both in terms of I said durability is good, but they're still trying to find better ways to do things. And we, as automotive engineers, that's what we do. So we do want to get the costs down, and we do want to make these vehicles more accessible to the market, because frankly, it's very difficult to imagine a world where we're selling only $80,000 cars.
Yeah, absolutely. Mike Jackson, when you talk to your colleagues from the supply base, do they feel the technology is ready?
Look, I think it requires a balance, right? I think, as Michael very eloquently stated, there's a lot of progress that's been made, and so I think this is, the supply base has been a very strong contributor to some of those technologies. At the same time, though, it's really a balance. So where are companies making money, right? And so it's a business, right? And so as much as government policy is an important component here, and there are a number of positive objectives, to come. The question is where are you making money currently, and in order to fund the investment in the technologies, and in order to ensure that they are strong and viable, and to continue to have this kind of a kind of 401k mentality, right? Diversification, right, across a range of technologies, across a range of solution sets. And so this is what's particularly important. Clearly there have been tremendous strides made, and I think this is very positive. But at the same time, there are also been many investments made in ICE technologies and others. And so it really requires certainly an understanding, and policy is important, and yet when policy, some of these the timelines that Michael highlighted, they're coming quickly. And so it requires a very significant shift, and all fundamentally changes the future here. And so again, very positive in the sense that look at how much progress has been made, and this is great. At the same time, the question, it comes back to the consumer.
Yeah. Simon, when your group looks at the strategies that the manufacturers have to employ to be able to meet these goals, do you guys see the technology ready and the supply base ready to be able to meet these to meet the goals?
Yeah, Bruce, that's a great question. In terms of time frames, I think part of it is a question of time frames, right? In terms of, I think Michael showed the levels of investments being made. We do see, and I'll get into this in my presentation, but different regions, because it is a global industry in a way, and you really have to start looking at other regions that are already, where maybe the US wants to be in 2026, 2027, to get some lessons learned for that and to understand the scale up needed. I agree with a lot of things said in terms of the complementary policies. The US, to really get ahead of China and to get to where Europe is, really does need to see those investments being made, and some of the sort of growth, right, questions overcome.
Yeah. It's interesting to see you bring up the global aspect, And Michael, when you were talking about the 24 grams per probably per mile or per kilometer, made me think of what I think the EU is facing. In
94, Bruce.
Yeah,
but that's still a long way from the 200 something we're at.
right, exactly. And the EU is expecting something like the 94 grams by 2030. And so it kind of puts us on the similar trajectory to the EU. And as we have seen recently, the EU in some cases has out EV China in some cases with the movement towards EVs, and of course in there it's more plug-in hybrids than EVs, but it's a different animal, isn't it?
Yeah, I would say it's comparing the two areas is risky. You know, much different markets in the European Union versus in the United States, different sizes of vehicles, different taxation policies.
Yeah.
That I think it would be very politically challenging to adopt many of the things that have moved that market so rapidly towards EVs.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Very good. One of the questions that came up from our audience, Michael mentioned the Alliance supports the EPA's GHG emission standards as they are in their current form. Did you feel the same way about NHTSA's CAFE standards? The Alliance support those in their current form?
I think we're still assessing it. They only came out a couple of weeks ago, and we're trying to figure out where we stand on things. But we do support moving forward and increasing fuel economy and improving greenhouse gas emissions. And like I said, I think we're pretty much all in on EVs at this point.
Yeah. It's as part of the transition, and this is something that we're going to be looking at for our conference coming up in July. Between now and 2026, 2030, where there's going to be this a time frame where manufacturers are still going to be building lots of internal combustion engine vehicles. And in terms of how are they, and I think you focused on that at Michael, by looking at the strong hybrid story, right? And looking at other different technologies within the internal combustion engines. Still a real challenge. One of the other questions that came from the audience is about alternative fuels beyond electricity, like e-fuels and carbon capture. Do you see them playing a role going forward?
I think there's a possibility there. It's a challenging area in terms of regulation and policy, where I think everybody's really focused on electric vehicles right now, but the U.S. fleet as a whole, we have, we sell 16, 17 million vehicles per year, and Simon may know the answer to this. I can't remember the number off my top of my head, but there's on the range of tens and hundreds of millions to hundreds of millions of other, well, it can't be tens, hundreds of millions plus of vehicles in the existing fleet. Those vehicles are all going to be around a long time, and the combustion engine vehicles that we're selling today will also be around a long time. So if there's opportunities for a low carbon, higher octane fuel, I think the auto industry would be open to those things. And those sorts of things could also hopefully reduce the emissions of the existing fleet at the same time.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Bob, I wanted to give you a chance. Do you have anything you want to add to the discussion on this particular topic?
Yeah, from a people related standpoint, my colleagues at the UAW, my economist colleagues, my colleagues at the OEMs know that this transition to electric vehicles is going to result in massive job dislocation. If you take a look at an ICE engine plant, you don't need nearly as many people. And if you look at a recent study that the UAW research department put out, they think that it's going to number 20 or 30,000 jobs lost permanently. And as they look at the Biden approach to introducing the technology, part of what they're seeing is this hope that as they provide financial incentives, whether they're grants or tax incentives, it's under the theory that if you pay for it, manufacturers will migrate to it. It's sort of, you build it and they will come kind of thing. I'm not sure that's great economic theory. And then what we're all experiencing now is a talent shortage, a war for talent. You not only need engineers and people that understand this market, but you need the people in the facilities that can do this type of work. And that is a tall task when you think of the retraining challenge and the fact that, there's the great resignation on board. So the war for talent and this potential challenge that the workforce is going to see in terms of loss of jobs, I think is something that has to be in part of the policy discussion.
Very good. Thank you. Michael, last question for you. We've got a lot of issues that are talking about dealing with these issues. One of more specific one has to do with the chargers. Has your group done anything to look at the number of chargers that would be needed to meet demand, say 2026 or 2030? Is 500,000 chargers enough?
That's something it's a great question. And that's something we're actively trying to figure out, because we think that's really important for even developing future policies on the automotive industry is what is enough and what is our progress towards that number. And I think just as importantly, where do they go? And so what we have been able to get our hands around is we've started to put together some principles for charging infrastructure. What sort of things does that charging infrastructure have to do? What does it have to look like? And those things are available on our website if anybody wants to check those out.
Yeah, I've seen this is an issue that I think is going to be continuing, especially because if you're looking at level 2 chargers versus the super fast chargers and different and the effects of the super fast chargers on the battery and how long the battery lasts if you use super fast chargers. I think there's still a lot of stuff that needs to get worked out on this. And the cost of installing some of the very fast chargers is quite a lot. And so almost, I would say prohibitive from a personal level because there's so much. I think we're going to stop here and move on to the next speaker, Simon. Simon, over the past 12 years, has worked collaboratively with partners on policy and legislative campaigns to secure major wins, including zero-emission vehicle programs, clean fuel standards, emission standards, clean vehicle incentive programs, and state clean energy laws. Prior to joining NRDC, he worked at the Transportation and Climate Division at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, where he co-authored studies on plug-in electric vehicles and climate mitigation strategies. He has also served as a fellow at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government and worked as an engineer, developed lithium-ion batteries for a startup company. He holds 2 bachelor's degrees from the University of California, Berkeley, a master's in technology and policy, and a PhD in engineering from MIT. Simon, welcome.
Well, thank you, Bruce, for that warm introduction. I know my colleague Luke Tarnischel in the past has spoken at this conference, and even though we're meeting virtually, I hope in the future we can all meet together. I'll just say, for me, and I hope for others, it's actually a really exciting time to be in the vehicle space. And as Michael has spoken, there's a lot of challenges, but there's also a lot of opportunity going forward. Many of you who are in this space for a while know that the level and rate of innovation, the level of transformation happening is quite quick. 20 years ago, when I was back working in the laboratories on lithium-ion batteries, developing cathodes and solid-state electrolytes, had you asked me 20 years later, that I'd be talking to you about federal climate policy on this online web-based conference system we call Zoom, I probably would have laughed. But we all, I probably wouldn't have believed you either if you had told me that Mercedes, the former king of diesel, is now building an electric sedan that's getting 620 miles of range on a single charge at a really just insane efficiency level. I probably wouldn't have believed you either. And so I think one of the things that we have to think about too is the rate of change, right, and the pace of change, and how quickly the industry as well as the market is evolving. And so when we look at the drivers of vehicle electrification, now if we go back 10 years, right, there were three models essentially in the US, an 85-mile range Nissan Leaf, a Chevy Volt, and a Tesla Roadster. And you look now at the global marketplace, right, you see that the EU is nearly at 30% of the market last quarter. China's rocketed up as well to 20% sales. The US is starting to see a real big bump in terms of sales, and it isn't really far behind. I mean, if we had surveyed everyone probably 10 years ago to give numbers, right, we probably would have been undercounting here. The other drivers of vehicle electrification, Michael did a lot of the heavy lifting here to talk about regulatory policy. There's other factors driving vehicle electrification, the market competition and the level of investment, the increase in product offerings, as well as the fundamental economic drivers, right, about electrification and the pace of innovation and battery improvements, really, bringing total cost of ownership to a very attractive level, as well as the driver around charging infrastructure. In terms of public policy, you really have to look globally to really understand some of the drivers around the regulatory policy. I think there's general agreement across many of the developed world, the developing world, that we've really got to start tackling climate change. We really need to take it seriously. We've got about 1.5 billion motor vehicles on the roads globally that spew out air pollution. And so let's do something about it. Nobody wants to cook the planet or live in a polluted megacity, whether you talk to folks in Asia, if you travel to Europe, or back here in the US. That's not great for the environment. It's not great for business, and nor is it great for our kids' future, frankly, if we're toast in a literal and figurative sense. So I'm going to take a look at Europe first off to maybe give some context around market competition investments, some of this particular driver. And that's because when you compare it with US federal policy and where the US industry may want to head, Europe is a good market, at least because they are at, despite the differences, there are at 4 or 5 years ahead of us. And one of the things that you'll see here is the market share, right, in EV sales has really skyrocketed over the past 2 years. Actually, Europe was actually behind the US maybe 3 years ago in terms of sales. And now over the past 2 years, due to significant investments, due to regulatory drivers as well, we're seeing, even the former diesel capital of the world, Germany, over a third of the vehicles now being a plug-in electric, together with UK. We all know about the Scandinavian nations. They're basically done, right? They're already pretty much at 100%. Really, this is the drivers here are really because of the major investments by automakers, the introduction of really compelling EV model offerings in a manner that maybe wasn't here in the US 2 years ago. And really the backdrop being also regulatory drivers like Europe's Fit for 55 climate policy and the setting of CO2 targets. In terms of the battery production, a really fascinating story here in Europe happening, of course. Just by 2025, there's 27 gigafactories being partially or fully financed or already built, with even more being planned. I think another 11 or so being planned by 2030. And in Europe, they've already secured about 60 billion in investments, and those are just the private investments. And really, for the first time ever in 2019, surpassing China, right? Surpassing China in terms of annual investments. And it's estimated that those investments are going to attract about 44,000 jobs in Europe, right? And those are really, right, the global competition in terms of maintaining leadership in the vehicle manufacturing and now the battery supply chain. I think the Biden administration is really watching these lessons as well. As you know, and Michael alluded to, in the first days of the administration, it sought these large public investments, right? These complementary investments for Build Back Better and through infrastructure investments to really develop these technologies. And if we turn to the US now back at home, nearly every automaker has really unveiled some serious investment plans over not just the longer term, but in some cases, really the near term, to shift over to electric drive technologies. And it's in part responds to this sort of understanding that you really got to invest or you kind of die in the global marketplace right now. This US product offering chart from the Bank of America global research firm, and if you also look at other forecasters like Baum and Associates, I'm sure IHS as well, really show that automakers are starting to ramp up an array of new models. The Bank of America estimates that basically out of the 383 nameplate offerings, about a third of those will be an electric vehicle, plug-in hybrid, electric, battery electric offering through model year 2025. That doesn't include, conventional strong hybrids or fuel cells. You are starting to also see consumer interest really growing. It's a crazy market, as everyone knows out there right now, where consumers are overpaying, for all vehicles, but in particular, those EVs, those limited EV models on the market right now. The Biden administration is also pushing investments to complement, right, the private ones already being made. Already 13 manufacturers, and you see some of these on the right-hand side, have announced about 75 billion, right? And that's an interesting number because I said 60 billion in Europe a couple of years ago. So 75 billion in new or renovated plant to build EVs across 6 states. And this is on top of the 14 billion already invested to build out the domestic battery chain. So it's fascinating to see how quickly these investments are coming. These are opportunities, of course, for the US to regain a leadership position globally. And US regulatory policy is certainly a clear driver. The first day, on day one of the Biden administration, he issued the executive order to really have economy-wide GHG emissions by 2030, versus a 2005 level. And this is some analysis that NRDC conducted on, using economic modeling to look at what the potential areas where those reductions could come from. The power sector, yielding the biggest reductions, followed quickly by the next biggest, really the biggest sector, transportation, followed by industrial buildings. A lot of this is consistent with sort of where Biden's policies are going, to really enable the U.S. to reduce emissions to the levels necessary. And it isn't, the tools in the transportation sector, by far the biggest is really GHG standards or fuel efficiency standards. And as Michael spoke before, the U.S. isn't really alone in this respect. There's many, many different markets, major markets, having their own CO2 or fuel consumption emissions. Sorry for the grams per kilometer. I couldn't find a grams per CO2. But what this is showing you is that, there's some spread, of course, given the different baselines of vehicles in each of the markets, but generally they're all on a similar pace. This is a little bit dated now, so that U.S. line out there showing 108 would be closer to the Canadian line, or pretty much right on top. But you can see sort of the EU's Fit for 55 policies really shown here. I think we had mentioned 92 or 94 grams per CO2, just in grams per kilometer. It's shown here as 59. But basically, the direction of many of the Asian countries are heading that way. China has already announced a plan for 2035 for all new vehicles to be, quote, eco-friendly. My guess is that's going to be a new energy vehicle or a zero emission vehicle, really. And not surprisingly, states are really moving to take action to address climate change, because transportation, if a state wants to do something on it, transportation is the biggest sector. There are about 17 states that are clean car states today, or about 40% of the market, based on California, who have adopted California's program. And just for some context here, there's often questions of why does California get to set its own emission standards? Well, California really retained that authority when the Clean Air Act was developed. So for over 50 years now, as it was really the first jurisdiction to really regulate vehicle emissions, even before the federal government stepped in, or before EPA was created under Nixon. We talked a little bit about the Biden administration policies. I'll list them sort of in categories here. I would say we've already seen some of the presidential executive orders come out. Light duty vehicle standards, which Michael covered quite a bit of. There's two sets here, the 23 to 26 model years, which are now finalized, and then sort of the 2027, which is of interest to this group as well, is where the standards will go. Earlier, the 50% EV target was mentioned for 2030. There's also a set of clean trucks planned, right, in terms of commercial trucks and buses with standards for both NOx as well as GHG proposed recently. The GHG was really around updating the phase 2 rules to account for the fact that ZEVs are now in the trucking space as well. And then EPA is considering standards for model year 2030 and beyond after that, and around the GHG. Those haven't been proposed. And I'll talk a little bit about the different investments in procurement policies of the administration momentarily, and we'll get into that a little bit. So as mentioned earlier, the two executive orders that are really relevant here are the climate goals for the country, as well as the Clean Cars and Clean Trucks plan issued, and really within that, that called on EPA and DOT to really set regulatory policies that reduce emissions, followed by the 50% zero emission sales goal by 2030. And those are really the two or three executive orders that are providing the backdrop. I won't bore you with the details because Michael's already gone through some of this, but there's a long history on the passenger vehicles, starting back to the Obama years, when under the Obama administration, EPA passed the final rules for GHGs from 2017 to 2025. And then, they issued the waiver for California. There was a joint agreement between automakers, labor, enviros, EPA, DOT, White House in California around a national program. That was altered or changed. We call it the Trump rollbacks in 2019 that happened. The California waiver was revoked in 2019. Then the Trump rollbacks by EPA happened and were finalized in 2020. Well, the Biden administration, of course, came in and quickly moved to restore as much as they could in 2021, back closer to the Obama standards, and then also pushing it out to 2026, followed quickly by EPA withdrawing its revocation of the California waiver. And this is sort of a similar chart to what Michael had shown, but sort of the circularity of all the past 10 years. You start with the rules under Obama, and then the Trump rollback pushed the rules to do a 1.5% rate of improvement. And Biden, his administration, has basically returned the rules back to that trajectory under Obama, and then in 2026 extended it to the 160, 162 level, which roughly, based on their modeling, is about 40 miles per gallon fleet average. These are real world values. I won't talk about certification values, but it's interesting because the certification values in 2026 are very close to the ones set by Obama in 2025. There's differences, a little bit of differences in crediting that Michael went through. But one might say that the Trump years really provided little certainty for any of the parties, including the environmental community. And maybe the only certainty was really for the lawyers getting a huge payday in the courts around these issues. I won't go into heavy duty too much, but I will note that there are two kind of sets of proposals here, as I mentioned before. The NOx proposal, which is looking to reduce NOx emissions starting in model year 2027, and as part of that, an update to the phase 2 greenhouse gas rules in model year 2027. There are two options really presented on trucks. Option one aims to set standards at similar levels to those adopted by California and other states, namely a 90% reduction in NOx emissions. Option two is a weaker one, which would likely, based on EPA's analysis, would be about 47% emissions reduction. We're obviously in see option one as a much more preferred option. There's places where that really needs strengthening, including, the incorporation of ZEV technologies into that mix to determine the level of reductions. In terms of the GHG side, a couple things here. The update really is looking at the market to update their market assessment around buses, around delivery trucks, where ZEV technology, and short haul trucks, where ZEV technology is really expected to make a significant penetration out in 2027 beyond. One of the interesting things is, though, EPA's assessment right now is that there will only be about 1.5% of those vehicles in the market. And so it calls into question sort of why, especially since many of the states have moved beyond that already. And if you just look at the states that have requirements in place. It actually exceeds 1.5%. So in our view, these updates of the GHG will really fall short of the potential. And certainly there's a lot of work to be done still. I will talk a little bit about the investment policies. The way we look at it, and Bruce did an excellent job to give the overview, showing the breakdowns going from 1.2 trillion in federal really infrastructure funding. About 50 billion of that is really eligible or sort of in the milieu of EVs directly or indirectly. And so I've tried to identify the buckets here. Some of those are indirect, so things like the congestion and air quality improvement programs for states, quite a bit of money there, but whereby EV programs may be eligible to reduce emissions, obviously. But just focusing on the direct funds, about 5 billion was allocated for spending on the national infrastructure network, right? A public infrastructure network. There is another 5 billion for medium and heavy duty alternative fueling infrastructure. That's really, you look at the public and ports side of the equation. And that includes, but isn't limited to just EV charging. Another 7 billion, if you add up, is really allocated to battery manufacturing and the supply chain, all the way up to recycling, as well as critical mineral research. And you've got another 5 billion actually allocated for zero or low emission buses, and 3 billion for vehicle to grid, electric grid integration. One important part of the EJA legislation was that it also amended the Public Utility Regulation Act, right? So this is sort of the federal governance over states and their utilities to really require states to consider measures to establish attractive EV rates that promote affordability and accessibility to EV charging, and that, in our view, can really accelerate third-party investments in EV charging. So it's almost like a federal call on states to develop those EV utility programs to really start getting at some of those harder to crack places that Michael mentioned as well, including, you think of multi-dwelling units and all those challenges, but you really need the utilities to step up their game, and this is a sort of a call federally to do that. Of course, there's a lot of unfinished business, I think, to the Biden administration's EV ambitions, as well as in Congress. In addition to completion of Biden's Clean Cars and Clean Trucks plan, there's a discussion around Build Back Better Round 2, you might call it. Some people are calling it, Manchin's reconciliation bill. Really, Bruce did a great job of talking about really within that Build Back Better component, the refundable tax credits for EVs, right? And as well as for new and used, about 9 billion worth. As well as tax credits for fueling infrastructure. There was also 5 billion for commercial EV trucks in there. Another 6 billion in tax credits for alternative fueling infrastructure, and some 17 billion in advanced manufacturing, as well as direct ZEV production. So, we will see how Manchin, how Congress views these, and if it can be made parts of the different package being discussed. Let's not also forget that there's also state investments, right, and private investments that need to be leveraged. And I'll just note that California just stepped up over the past 2 years and has allocated or proposed allocating in their budget $10 billion, right? So 10 billion sort of nation state levels of investments in ZEVs over the next several years. Of course, there are ways to address some of the gaps in charging infrastructure in terms of EV readiness codes, as well as part of the building standards, having model legislation around that, model building standards, which need to be adopted state by state, as well as this attractive EV rates and programs given by utilities across the country. So lots of work to be done still to realize the ambitions and actually be able to go beyond it. Examples throughout the world where this is happening now, and probably some lessons learned that would be great, Bruce, for your team of students and maybe others around to take a look at and draw lessons from. And I'll just flag, I think here there's really some common goals that I'm hoping all of us can work together around. Obviously, reducing pollution is job number one for our organization, but also in terms of increasing US competitiveness, right? Not falling behind in terms of standards globally, investments globally, and innovation. Domestic supply chain, really insourcing EV manufacture in the supply chain, development of critical mineral technologies. And then of course, access to charging infrastructure where you move from, 1 in 30, ratios in terms of vehicle to charging down to 1 to 20 to 1 to 10. So that really charging infrastructure doesn't become a speed bump on the road. It doesn't slow the deployment of vehicles and the market growth. And of course, the job quality, right? Job quality, not just growing the jobs, but making sure they're quality jobs through training, worker access to new jobs, investments, labor standards. All of these are part of that ecosystem, and to make sure that the US remains competitive and really in a pole position in this race. All right, I'll stop there.
All right. Thank you very much, Simon. We've got a few questions for you. We got a few environmental questions that we wanted to bring up to see how you think about these things. One of the areas that we're looking at because of the mineral issues, right, and trying to get those into the U.S. What do you think is the best way to develop mine the new materials needed for EVs without creating ecological disasters such as strip mining?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I'll just first start off that there's no question that we need to be able to develop and utilize the materials to make lithium-ion batteries, and that those supply chains need to meet, basically basic expectations about sustainability around environmental performance and frankly, human rights as well, and labor rights, right? And so this isn't just an EV car issue. It's actually across the supply chain, because it's not like we all of a sudden magically started using minerals. What's happening is that we are now shifting to different types of minerals, some of which are critical minerals, from cobalt to nickel to lithium. The question, I think, is really about ensuring the right sets of mining policies, right, are in place. I'll just note that the mining legislation, the governing mining legislation, hasn't been updated since the 1800s in the US, right? And so some of those, if you think just moving things to the US automatically improves things, that's not always the case, right? And so you really need to look at the project, you really need to look at the sets of regulations. I think two of the places that we should be looking to are both Europe and China in terms of provisions around recycling and take back, right? Policies to close the loop, because we all want to have a closed materials loop in the production systems, and those are examples that have been developed and are being implemented today, and the US could learn a lot from that. And I'll just note that I've worked in the semiconductor and the lithium battery industries. in my past lives. And I will just note that it's interesting because the US really developed those technologies if you go back historically to that. But now those supply chains are in other countries, right, have been developed and gone after. And there's an opportunity to bring back those supply chains to the US and those manufacturing, but we need to do it right. We need to make sure that those, that we're hitting the gold standard across all the metrics.
One of the things that we were working on is looking at the recycling issues. We've had a couple conferences past. I think it might have been the powertrain conference last year, where we had some recycling experts talk about how they've got the system set up for lithium ion recycling, and the automotive industry actually does a fantastic job of recycling lead acid batteries. So we actually have the understanding and the capability. The scale is another issue, and that's one of the things that we're still working on. But it's a nice piece of the puzzle that we actually have some understanding of. And there's some very good companies that are already set up and just ready for scale to actually show up. Simon, one of the other issues that we're interested in that we've been talking about has to do with the ZEV mandate. What do you see for from a manufacturer perspective? What do you see the biggest challenges for them in meeting those ZEV mandates?
Yeah, it's just for a little bit of background for the audience, California, but really, there's probably like 16 to 17 jurisdictions around the world that have set, basically full goals to get to zero emission vehicles by 2040, 2035, some even 2030. I think there's one country that said in 2025. But the program in California that is relevant, it's interesting that they call it a zero emission vehicle program because it isn't 100% battery electrics or fuel cells. There's about 20%, allowance for 20% plug-in hybrids there. So the nomenclature might not be the best, but in terms of electric vehicles, the 100% of the vehicles with the ability to plug in or fuel on hydrogen, that's the challenge, right? And the question, I think, in terms of getting up to that level is, again, pushing out enough model offerings over time to give consumers, right? And that's part of the standard, right? To really increase the model availability and offerings and to have that pressure and continued pressure to get to the climate and air quality goals. I'd say the two biggest complementary policies to that are what we've been talking about today, charging infrastructure incentives. California is kind of putting their money where their mouth is. Again, $10 billion of investments. I think our goal now is to expand that sort of level across the states, across the country through federal legislation, but frankly, matching state as well as private investments. And there's ways to do it, I think, when folks are working together. I will flag as part of that, we are working together with many of the stakeholders here, including Auto Alliance, the National EV Charging Initiative, which is a collaboration between interest groups in the industry, in the environmental, in the social justice and community group sectors, to really have a coordination around some of the investments being made federally across the states to really streamline things, right? Because you can imagine 5 years later, if those investments haven't been doled out, that could really slow things down. If they're done in an uncoordinated manner between states, or some states apply and some states don't, you don't really have a national network. So some of those barriers, right, we really need to come together to work on those challenges. In some sense, it's easy to set a target, but it's harder to make sure that those complementary measures that enable that are in place.
Very good. Thank you. Does the other people on the panel have anything to add to this this topic?
I guess I'll just add that we wholeheartedly agree, these complementary measures are really critical, and more so than ever in the past, in my experience, we're interested in working with other stakeholders and trying to move forward and enable the electric future.
Michael, are there credits available within the California plan for ZEVs?
There's some flexibilities there, but I think, it would still be accurate to say, I mean, there's still a big challenge there. There's,
Yeah.
I don't know all the details off the top of my head. Simon?
Simon,
Yeah, so just keep in mind, there's a credit number that the ZEV program works through, and the actual sales required is a function of what automaker strategies are utilized to meet those, as well as some flexibilities there, plug-in hybrid usage, all of that, as well as the ability to buy and sell credits like in other systems. It's sort of like real world versus label values for the ZEV system as well. Right. I will note, in the past, we've been a little bit critical of the ZEV program because the label values weren't the real world values, but we'll see as ARB goes forward how quickly, how true to that goal post, right? They've made the program. I think all of us are still going through the details of the draft proposal released just a week or so ago. I think the other thing to keep in mind too is, as we look at improvement rates, right? Whether you think ICEs can only do 3% or 5%, some say 8%. Once you throw EVs into the picture, those improvement rates kind of go out the window. You really need to talk about internal combustion engine improvement rates plus the volumes of EVs, because EVs, right, automatically out the window, you're talking about an improvement rate of a 300% jump, right? And so the 8% that, annual, you really need to pull out what the internal combustion engine improvement rate within that is. And so I think really, there's some areas of debate on internal combustion engine improvement rates, but really where we need to focus on is how quickly, how fast can we get EVs out on the road. I think the automaker plans are actually quite consistent with ARB's goals of 100%. I mean, if you look at some of the automotive companies, some are saying even faster, that they want to go faster than that. So, really this is about how quickly can we put a plug on every vehicle and get that infrastructure out.
Yeah, one of the comments that came from the audience is it kind of fits into that. Are EVs technologically ready, or what happens if they're not quite as ready as we hope they are? I mean, Tesla has done very well, and then the bolts started on fire, and GM's replacing every one of them. I mean, from a manufacturer standpoint, that's got to be a nightmare. That they didn't put they didn't want them to start on fire on purpose. So this shows you that kind of the technology is challenging still, and we are, as Michael was saying, we're still in the infancy stage of our maybe adolescent stage of battery development and the how the batteries are going to be used and how the EVs are going to be used. So we've got a lot of there's a lot of work to do, I think, to be done in this area. Simon, thank you very much. Well, welcome back. I want to start off by thanking our affiliates again for their support for our programs that allow us to put on our conferences. I want to start off this section, the second part of the conference, with some survey results. A survey that we did recently with one of our students looking at a couple of our students looking at the effects of the Biden administration policies on the automotive industry. All right. I did a survey of experts from the automotive manufacturers, suppliers, government, NGOs, academia, and consulting. Very similar to what we do with our powertrain strategies for the 21st century study, now the propulsion strategies for the 21st century. We asked for their predictions about how the policies put forth by the administration will impact the automotive industry. And we did this fairly recently. A little disappointed in the number of respondents, but when I looked at the titles and the people that responded, I was very pleased to see a lot of people that have participated in advance in the past, but also had a very good insight into the industry and be able to answer these questions. One of the first set of questions we asked was, how effective will the following administration policies be in transitioning the U.S. auto industry to meet the needs of the 21st society? We got 3 sets of slides here, and the scale 1 to 5, very ineffective to extremely effective. 3 in this case is moderately effective. So support for unionized EV manufacturing, creating 1 million jobs in the U.S. auto industry, new star rating for vehicle safety, research on automotive safety, introduction advanced impaired driving technologies, expand research into AV pedestrian detection, transitioning U.S. government vehicles to 100%. None of these actually even reach the moderately effective in helping the industry transition. But when we started getting into some of the other options, increasing zero emission market share to 50%, creating jobs in the clean energy industry. These are all things that have come out of the administration. Establishing minimum performance standards for crash systems, research on EV battery second life applications, national security technology designations, for example, for semiconductors, investments in electric public transportation, and consumer incentives for EVs. We're starting to get close to the moderately effective. And then in the last set of options, investment in battery recycling, support for domestic manufacturing of EV technologies, 2.5 million in charging grants for fueling grants, and DOE support for battery research, EPA increasing annual emission standards, and NHTSA increasing annual fuel economy standards. You can see that we're starting to get over the moderate and starting into the very effective in terms of help in transitioning the auto industry. Very interesting that it was the standards that were the biggest factors that the respondents saw. We also looked at please ask them to rate the following EV goals by their importance to the auto manufacturers. Here you're at a scale of 1 to 7. 7 is very important. 1 is very unimportant. You can see the biggest areas are reduce the price gap between EVs and comparable EV vehicles, meet EPA emissions regulations, implement a charging network fit for the US population, meet CAFE regulations, increase consumer acceptance of EVs, as well as invest in EV battery technology R&D. Very, very important to the manufacturers, very similar to the previous slides. Now, the infrastructure bill devotes $110 billion to improving roads and bridges and other important vehicle structures. How effective will the Biden administration be in accomplishing this over the next 10 years? And 3 again is moderately effective. They'll be able to. The respondents think they'll be able to repair existing road and bridges, but not as good in terms of in constructing new roads and bridges. When we looked at strategies, the infrastructure bill devotes 7.5 million to install EV chargers across the country. They stated that 500,000 chargers by 2030. How much will each of the following groups benefit from the expansion of chargers? And the most benefit, according to the respondents, was charging station manufacturers, then electric companies and EV owners, and then manufacturers. And we haven't seen the manufacturers really jump into this game in terms of charging, except for, of course, the Electrify America, which is the one of the support things that came out of the Volkswagen scandal, in which they had to pour a couple $1 billion into charging infrastructure. So we asked them, what year do you predict the U.S. will have the 500,000 public chargers? They were averaging about by 2033 with ranges of 2026 to 2040, pretty close to the 2030 timeframe, but a little farther. But when you looked at how many public charging ports will be needed for the U.S. to increase market share to the following, if they increase EV market share to the following percentages. So 50% EV market share, they suggest, this is just public, not private, about 780,000, 75% EV market share, 1.4 million, and 90%, much more at 2.9 million. Charging ports, not stations. A station could be very similar to a gas station that has multiple ports. So it's not actually each charging station, it's actually a charging port. So this is something that it kind of fits in with what we're seeing in China, and something that U.S. is going to have to work on. The infrastructure bill allocated 73 billion to improve the U.S. electrical grid. How effective will this funding be for accomplishing the following goals? The major hitters here are building urban EV chargers. It will help with that. It will incentivize renewable energy, but these are basically just moderately effective and handle increased electricity demand. These are all good things. One would probably think, you would hope it would be moving in the more up to scale than what they're saying. Now they targeted the charging aspect. However, it's likely consumers will need more incentives to purchase EVs. Therefore, please rate the following incentives in their effectiveness to attract consumers to EVs. And it's something that we've talked a little bit about, at state point of sale rebates, exclusive EV access to city centers, carpooling access. At least these have crossed over the mid-range from moderately effective, a little over the moderately effective. Not so much for reduced licensing fees, toll exemptions, reserved free parking. We also looked at other issues. The number one thing was federal tax credits. Federal, followed by federal point of sale rebates. This is something that the government was trying to decide whether tax credits or point of sale rebates would be a better plan. Free or discounted charging, and state tax credits, sales tax exemptions, and rebates on home charger installation all were above the average of moderately effective. So some good things here in terms of potential support for EVs. Besides a lack of charging, there are things that may dissuade customers from purchasing an EV. Please rate how much an effect each of the following challenges will have on future EV sales. And as you would, no surprise here, vehicle cost is the number one thing, followed by slow charging, not just lack of charging. One of the things we found in our previous studies was, and research was that it wasn't just charging, lack of charging stations or ports, it was how long it took to charge the vehicle. Still an issue. Lack of vehicle range, as well as lack of model choice. And the manufacturers are really putting forth an effort now to try to get those more models, types of models out there. Other things that have not as effective, that will dissuade them, would lack of third-party repair shops, possible increase in road taxes, something that we talked about earlier, where from the Highway Trust Fund gets its money from gas taxes. If you have all EVs and all or vehicles that have great fuel economy, you're not paying those taxes as much, and so there are issues with that. Vehicle performance and handling, not so much. Besides the infrastructure bill, how likely is it that more legislation will be passed to address the following issues? Investment in battery research and development is number one, followed by an increase in number of public charging stations and consumer EV rebates, and energy transition to natural gas or renewables, and consumer EV tax reductions. So those are some of the main things. These are, I would caution that these are preliminary results. We haven't done all our analyses on these topics. They won't probably change very much, but it's something that we'll be putting out within the next, probably next month, that we'll have these stuff that we'll be sharing first with our affiliates, and then for the people who participated, and then and later on on our website. All right. Let's go to our next speaker, Mike Jackson. Mike is the Executive Director of Strategy and Research at OESA. Mike leads a dynamic team to research industry trends and produce compelling insights, informing members on ways to navigate market dynamics and enhance competitiveness. Mike also leads the OESA Chief Purchasing Officers and Chief Financial Officers Councils, and is responsible for leading a series of strategic OESA events. Prior to OESA, Mike spent more than 20 years in roles leading strategy. He directed the regional vehicle production forecasting practice at IHS Markit that Mike Hartrick was talking about. After serving as a senior strategist roles in Alcoa, Fujikura, and Faurecia. Mike holds a Bachelor's of Science in Management Strategy from Eastern Michigan University and an MBA in International Business from Wayne State University. Mike, we're looking forward to hearing the story of how the suppliers are seeing the Biden administration. Take it away.
Great. Thank you, Bruce. Really appreciate it. You see everything okay there?
Yeah, I want to get your picture up here. All right, you're ready to go.
Perfect. Thank you. Really appreciate it. Great content. Really appreciate the insights there from Michael and Simon, and yours as well there, Bruce. So with that, let me just walk you through a little bit. I'm certainly not a policy expert, and yet I do understand the market pretty well. And so on behalf of our more than 500 member firms at OESA, it's really a pleasure to have the opportunity to share some insights here today. The title of my presentation here is called Navigating the Next Shockwave. And certainly what I want to do is just provide a little bit of context, talk about the market, but then touch on how policy has significant implications in terms of impacting suppliers and certainly stakeholders within the industry as a whole. So with that, let me just jump ahead, give you a little bit of a rundown. We'll talk a little bit about global context. I want to just put the EV demand picture into global context. We'll come back to the US market and we'll look at sales and output dynamics, and then we'll look at the supplier response, and then we'll wrap things up with a couple of takeaways. With that, I just want to highlight clearly, it's a dynamic time, as everybody has indicated, on a number of different fronts. And so more recently here, obviously the Russian invasion there of Ukraine, it just highlighted a number of different aspects in terms of the overall economy globally. Certainly, the human toll there is terrible and obviously weighs on, and that's certainly the top priority. But at the same time, it also weighs on the economy as a whole in Europe, and so as a result, it also creates tremendous uncertainty from markets. We're talking about markets. We're talking about EVs. EVs are quite from a pricing perspective, they're much more expensive than a typical vehicle, and so when consumer sentiment or consumer confidence is at risk, it has a significant impact on the overall economy and creates havoc, if you will, for stakeholders, trying to anticipate and navigate tremendous changes here. If we look at the impact that obviously the pandemic has had here over the past couple of years, it's been absolutely devastating. Again, in a human toll and also then on an economic toll. And so from a regulatory perspective, it represents a pretty challenging time for the industry to then proceed and transition toward electrification and address a number of different challenges here that the industry faces. And so with that, I simply want to highlight a couple of points. One, obviously the recession here as a result of the pandemic was severe in 2020 there, but we saw then a pretty robust recovery for a couple of different reasons. Obviously, base effects, and so here in North America, pretty strong level of response, and then at the same time, then now we're seeing that consumers here in the U.S. and beyond, obviously, have as a result of lockdowns and a wide range of policies, certainly have saved more. And so there's a tremendous amount of savings that's available in order to spend. And so what we've seen then is, contributing to pretty robust levels of growth on a global basis here in 2021. Now what we're seeing, though, is a little bit more risk here in the 2022 timeframe. And then as a result of the Russian invasion there in Ukraine, this is here from Wells Fargo here at the end of last month. And so the outlook has been reduced a bit. And so we look at that, and then, what does that mean then for stakeholders, particularly within the automotive sector? Obviously, in terms of other shock waves that we've seen, energy and what are the implications here with regard to oil? But then oil is also a huge component in terms of feedstocks for petrochemicals and resins and the rest. If we look at obviously natural gas as well, it has huge implications on a number of different fronts in terms of inputs, but then also in terms of logistics, additional costs across the board. And so we'll talk about that in a minute. What does that mean then in terms of prices at the pump? Tremendous volatility, and in Europe, clearly costs were already higher, and yet what we see here is we're at historic highs here relative to fuel prices here in the U.S. and in the rest of the world as well. They've moderated some. This is again from the end of last month. But what does it mean then relative to the industry? Well, this certainly would provide a bit of a tailwind in terms of consumers then perhaps willing to consider electric vehicles here going forward. And so this is one element that is certainly an important one to consider. But it also then is a cause for concern for consumers in terms of their willingness to spend and in terms of looking at and considering the purchase of new vehicles here going forward. Not a big surprise, but the supply chains that extend into Ukraine and Russia have been impacted dramatically as a result of the invasion. And so what does it mean? Well, significant implications relative to shortages. And so this has impacted the market there in Europe rather dramatically. And certainly, as was mentioned earlier, in terms of nickel sources out of Russia, but also palladium is a neon gas for semiconductor production. Significant implications here across the board. And so there are a number of different geopolitical elements here that also we take into account, right? So in looking at global demand, then what's pretty remarkable is the element here that what began with the pandemic in 2020 contributed to then this dramatic shortage relative to semiconductors that effectively hamstrung the industry globally. And so for manufacturers and suppliers, millions of units, tens of millions of units were lost globally as a result of these shockwaves. And so it does, certainly, beg the question, well, how to plan, more effectively, how to, navigate, and certainly, tremendous credit to the supply base and to manufacturers in terms of coming up with and managing, remarkably effectively in the face of protocols and constraints and a number of different elements here we'll talk about here a little bit more. But I guess the key point here is that overall the market at the start of this year, this is from our friends at LMC Automotive as of the March timeframe. And again, certainly there are some additional headwinds as we look at the market globally. And so why is that important? Well, let's talk about that. So when we look at electrification, and we've heard some great information, and I think it's pretty remarkable to think electrification, as it's defined here, does include plug-in hybrids, and more broadly speaking, it includes a range of certainly it's not just pure battery electric vehicles. The key point here is that in 2021, even in the face of significant volatility, the reality is that the overall volume grew globally dramatically, 108% increase from 2020 levels. And the remarkable thing as well is that even in the year of the pandemic, with 2020 level sales growing by over 43%, it's an incredible thing that, and it speaks to the fact that what was mentioned earlier, a broader range of products. And so if we look at some of the initial vehicles, right? Initial vehicles were in some ways intended to be beta models, right? The idea for manufacturers to learn, to gather information, and to improve. And so this is effectively what they were. Now what we're seeing is, clearly passenger cars have fallen out of favor in many markets. And so with the a significant increase in the number of battery electric vehicles within the SUV space, demand is also then contributed dramatically. And so this also bodes well because on the crossover side, certainly greater pricing power along with greater functionality. And so this has also been a huge driver in terms of the kind of activity that we've seen. What I also want to highlight then here is if we look across a range of markets. So if we look at Europe grew last year. This is pretty incredible. So 20 to 2021, we're looking at EVs. The total market in Europe was flat, and yet EVs grew by 66%. That's pretty remarkable. And again, this is BEVs and PHEVs. But what's important here is to also remember why this is, right? And we talked about Europe and Europe driving and pushing ahead, but one of the elements that we consider here is, Tesla really, Tesla overperformed in a great fashion. And so what it also did then is it dramatically changed the perception of luxury. And so Europe being so luxury dependent, it really recognized that it had to push in this direction because Tesla was proven so successful. It does, though, introduce a number of different elements and a number of different concerns, as Bob mentioned here a little bit ago, that okay, well, obviously there are many fewer parts in a pure battery electric vehicle. And so what are the implications here with regard to the workforce? And so, adopting or requiring very stringent standards and that, foster innovation, can be good, but there also may be some very real consequences. And so it's something that's really important to make sure that it's understood before it's imposed and certainly executed. So with that, I also highlight then China, dramatic growth. And what's pretty remarkable here as well is that in 2020, Europe actually outpaced China, actually outperformed, actually had higher levels of electric vehicle sales than China in 2020. China came back with tremendous rigor and really tremendous growth, 155% growth when the total market was only up 4.7%. Why is this important? Well, clearly, if we look at China, there are it's not an open market. Government policies are very restrictive, and so consumers don't have the option to purchase an ICE offering in many cities, in many high population, high density areas. And so as a result, it's a bit like comparing apples and oranges, right? And the idea is that we need to make sure that policies are important to drive technologies and to drive adoption, but at the same time there are real costs, and so it's really important to manage these. And so if we look at then North America has grown also tremendously, almost 100% growth here last year, when the market grew by just under 4%. So particularly important. And so, clearly, if we look at policies that are coming, they offer some significant tailwinds as well. So let's come back to the U.S. market, and this is just a kind of a quick recap. We've heard some great information here earlier from Michael. He highlighted some tremendous opportunity, in terms of some of the granular detail that really support and encourage. So, clearly rejoining the Paris Accord, looking at a tremendous amount of funding to support EV, battery research and development. California having greater autonomy in terms of setting standards. Federal fleet, contributing to some demand there as well. And then, clearly a number of manufacturers globally pushing, and obviously it's a whole lot has changed, looking at charging stations as well. So all of these elements contribute to some significant momentum. And so this is, it certainly is helpful to support this. The question is, though, what are consumers willing to pay? And so there are some very real implications for manufacturers and suppliers that have already invested. And so it's really, this is where I think, it's so important is this balancing act of clearly our members are very much excited about and very engaged in pursuing electrification. And so developing the technologies as a result, to support that. At the same time, though, it's really important in terms of recognizing elements here that contribute to that, and potentially some of the knock-on consequences as well. So, quick point here. If we look at the labor force gap, I mean, just if we look at a number of different factors that are impacting suppliers in terms of shock waves. The red line here is this kind of line of best fit here. If we look at the U.S. labor force, the deep blue line, so the number of folks in the labor force, and then we look here, the net difference in the gray bars here to the right, we're looking at the better part of 3.6 million jobs in terms of the gap. And so there are many, many more jobs than there are workers. And so this is a significant challenge. And it also then speaks to a talent shift that's required as well. And so this is a really important one here going forward, the kind of skill sets that are going to be required and needed in order to be competitive here going forward. So we look at labor market wages, very volatile here, obviously, and during the pandemic, and policy in some ways contributed here as well, as far as an additional package that supported workers and for a longer period of time. And so this has been a challenge, continues to be a challenge here for the industry as a whole. A quick one here, if we look at federal funds rate, clearly the Fed having expected the potential for a transitory impact of inflationary impacts here. Inflation actually persisted, and we're looking at historic highs in the past 40 years. So the Federal Open Market Committee raised the policy rate here by a quarter point in March, and yet their meeting minutes from that meeting have also then tracked, and they're anticipating 2 50-point rate hikes here during their May and June meetings, respectively. Why is that important? Well, significant implications for the consumer, right? In terms of what does that mean for mortgage rates? What does it mean for consumer big ticket purchases in terms of a consumer purchasing a vehicle? All of a sudden, it does represent some real costs that contribute to and can weigh on overall demand, despite the fact that we're, obviously demand is constrained. If we look at the yield curve, the 10-year Treasury minus the 2-year Treasury, this is a remarkably accurate indicator of a signal for a recessionary environment. It's not something that we're, certainly there's 35 basis points that are still, represented in that spread. And yet, obviously, we know that rate hikes are on tap. And so it's certainly something that we continue to monitor closely. Why do I mention this? Well, it's another factor that contributes to the long-range planning environment that all stakeholders have had to manage. It's a pretty incredible environment when we think about the amount of volume lost over the past 2 years, and even here in 2022, that contribute to and weigh on the overall the business picture for stakeholders. So with that, I just want to highlight, if we look at the historically, the compound annual growth rate of 2.6% in terms of kind of a price index by commodity, and so an aggregate net of a collection of inputs to the manufacturing industry, to automotive manufacturing. Now, it certainly isn't comprehensive in any way, but it's indicative. And so I think the important piece here is historically we're looking at 2.6% rate of growth for prices. And now we're looking at nearly 10%. So a nearly 10% compound annual growth rate over this time frame. So incredibly challenging. And so that represents a significant headwind for suppliers and the industry as a whole, for all players. So let me just touch here a little bit on sales and production dynamics. If we look at historically the inventory stock, it's kind of an amazing thing here that, back in 2018, there were 4 million units of inventory, on dealer lots. And if we look at the end of last year, it was 1.2 million units. And so clearly a dramatic shift. And so, supply and demand, very little stock, a significant amount of demand, simply meaning that incentives are down dramatically and transaction prices are up significantly for a variety of reasons, right? If we come back to the semiconductor piece, it's very, very important. And so clearly our support is fully behind a resolution here with the CHIPS Act. And so this is a really, really crucial because that alone has contributed to a disproportionate impact here for the industry and as a whole. If we look here then at average transaction prices, through the roof, right? So historically, in that same, go back to that 2018 timeframe, average transaction price in that $33,000 to $34,000 price point. We're now looking at $45,000 plus. And so why is this important? Well, it's important because we know that demand, availability of semiconductors is constrained. And so that means that manufacturers are rightly aligning and allocating sourcing of chips to those vehicles that are most profitable. And so that's going to include your pickups, your SUVs, those that have the greatest pricing power. And so that bodes well. At the same time, though, that represents a significant headwind for suppliers, because suppliers don't have the ability then to update or change their pricing. The pricing for the vehicle changes, but pricing for components has to be negotiated. And so this represents a pretty significant challenge relative to meaningful cost increases here over the past period of time. So quickly, if we look at vehicle buying conditions, if we look at vehicle buying conditions index here from the University of Michigan, it's at 46 here at the start of the year. It's certainly in negative territory. If you look at the rationale for it, prices are high. 57% indicate that that's the reasoning. So prices are too high in order to consider purchasing a vehicle at this point in time. So it's an interesting one, because if we look at, again, as I mentioned, the industry had been performing at a pretty remarkably strong level. And so what's important here, we look, the blue line here represents production, annual production here in North America, US, Canada, Mexico. The green line represents light vehicle sales. And so sales certainly includes a significant number of imports. Break even is this, the gray line here at the bottom. Well, what we see is that production was actually below break even for 2 years in a row. And so this represents a significant hurdle. So suppliers have been underwater in some respects on average, okay, in terms of having to deal with that break-even level being above the production for the past 2 years. And yet, and so that coupled with then regulatory pressures, it does represent a significant, hurdle here going forward. So it's, that said, we do anticipate, as forecasted here, that production levels will rebound, and we're on tap here for 15 million units of output here from 13 million units last year. So net, 2 million units of additional volume was on tap at the start of the year. That's come under some pressure already. But it's an important one to consider, because certainly funding and profitability is crucial in order to fund here going forward to the transition toward these newer technologies and to comply with new regulation. So a quick one here, if we look at prices at the pump, it obviously varies dramatically across the country. And so if we look at some of the smile states, right, if we look at the West, it would certainly stand to reason that if prices are higher in these states, it certainly would lend support to a higher level of electrification, as was mentioned earlier, 14% in California relative to 4% on the national average. And then, certainly Florida as well. And I think you'll see to some degree a shift there in Texas as well. But, clearly the key piece here is a wide range of variability, and so a number of different components that contribute to overall demand. So quick point here, we do a survey of our executive members, and the key piece here is that where are things at for the first quarter. We actually, our members became a bit more optimistic. The survey, supplier barometer is a measure of sentiment on the outlook, the 12-month outlook for the business. And so they've become a bit more optimistic. Now, clearly, this was effectively completed prior to the invasion of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And so that's contributed to significant headwinds. And so I would anticipate that will weigh on the barometer here for the second quarter. That said, if we look at the greatest threats to the industry, production shutdowns, this is a significant challenge. And this really comes back to the semiconductor element that we talked about a little bit earlier. So the CHIPS Act, absolutely crucial. And in particular with an element there that has to do with the legacy, legacy chips, that are an important piece there as well. Labor availability constraints, also a significant challenge. If we look at continued issues relative to the pandemic, likelihood of higher interest rates, and then weakness in the overall economy, also contributing factors there as well. So if we look at the IHS market forecast here for North America, significant reductions here as a result of the March forecast. So we started out the year here and we've already seen significant reductions as a result of a number of headwinds. And so this represents a very meaningful challenge for suppliers and the industry as a whole in terms of managing costs and in terms of pursuing and adhering to policy and innovating in a compelling way. If we look here quickly, this is another highlight of electrification here for North America. This is from Auto Forecast Solutions. So here, looking at the end of the forecast horizon, that 2029 timeframe. We're looking at 96 brand new or 96 unique domestically built battery electric vehicle nameplates. So sourced here. What's pretty remarkable is so the BEV count and the production volume, contributes to 3.5 million units. So 3.5 million units divided by 96 unique nameplates. It really only translates to just under 37,000 units per nameplate. So as much as there are policies and subsidies and regulations that are driving a lot of activity, if you were to back out Tesla alone and take out high volume nameplates like a Model 3, a Model Y, that would have huge implications in terms of what it means in terms of being profitable on a program within this the forecast horizon. So this is certainly something that we're mindful of on behalf of our members, and so Clearly, we support the idea of innovation to pursue gains within the space. Just want to do it in concert, in conjunction with the administration. So a quick one here, if we look at research and development technology investments, this is kind of an interesting one. If you look at 21 to 22, a little bit of a shift, but basically the top two, looking at advanced material technologies, composites, lightweight materials, and then powertrain technologies, both of these are tied at 2.7. So these are, if you had additional dollars for R&D investment, where would you spend it? So basically lightweighting and powertrain technologies. So powertrain being electrification. And so these two areas are absolutely crucial. And this is really where suppliers are focused on investing. So couple quick takeaways. What are your biggest challenges and opportunities as the industry prepares for a battery electric vehicle future? Number one, new customers and technologies are driving innovation. 78 responses here indicate that. So this is a really, really significant driver, no question. And our members are excited to participate in this space. Number two is program profitability. And so this is an element where I think it's important. It's very crucial. In some ways, we know that scale is critical. And so it really comes down to doing due diligence and assessing programs that I think are the most viable. Quickly, let's kind of wrap things up here. If we look at takeaways, the economy obviously shocks, represent tremendous impact on the economy. The potential to reduce demand. If we look at the potential for volatility and inflation, clearly the risks of recession are also something to be aware of. So scenario planning is crucial. Attack cost recovery, yes, but looking for and planning for weak links within the supply chain are absolutely crucial as well. CapEx, we know that crisis accelerates risks, and certainly the transition to better electric vehicles is something to be aware of and to position for and to have a seat at the table, no question. Just be mindful of the potential impact there for profitability. But I think this is an important one. If we look at where we are now, I think from a cultural perspective and having worked remotely here for such a long period of time, there's much less resistance to change in the midst of some of the volatility that we've faced. And so I think there's an opportunity for suppliers and all stakeholders to be bold here at this point in time. So, I think with that, I'll hand it back over to Bruce. Thank you for the opportunity and look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Mike. We got some good questions for you. One of them has to do with the issue of the microchips. Now EVs require even more microchips. How much do you think the microchip shortage, what kind of impact will that have on EV production in the US?
Yeah, it's a great question. But I think it really depends on each automaker, right? Because of if we look at a case like, once again, if we look at Tesla, really setting the bar, if you will. And by what I mean by that is they brought, in many cases, development of their chips in-house and some of the software. And so in doing so, they were able to repurpose what they had available in order to use what they had in order to keep building. And so it's an incredibly complex, but incredibly sophisticated and very successful strategy. Not everyone has that capability. And this is a really important element as well on the talent side, right? All of a sudden now the automakers and suppliers are going to be competing with, for talent. There's going to be a global war on talent in this regard. But in terms of chips, there's a distinction between some of the more modern, and some of the legacy chips that have been so critical here in terms of contributing to shortages and production stoppages here more recently. I know that if we look at RJ Scaringe at Rivian indicated that he anticipated that effectively we're looking at kind of a 6-month window here of further constraints, and I think that's probably pretty reasonable. We know that it's going to be, sometime here into the 2022 timeframe.
Do the other panelists have anything to say about the microchips and the effects it might have on EV production? That's okay. We've got other questions. Mike, when you look at you guys have really studied global supply chains all the time. How do you see that the global supply chains changing over the next 5 to 10 years?
Well, I think, like you mentioned, we will see a significant amount of localization for a variety of reasons, right? To mitigate geopolitical risk, but also then to look at, we see that there's been just tremendous impact in terms of logistics, costs, and a number of factors there as well. But I think as well, Simon talked about it a little bit as well. If we look at what's happening, we know that policy is such in China that it can dictate terms, right? But at the same time, we also know that much of the electricity in China is coal-fired, is generated from coal-fired facilities. Well, that doesn't contribute to the gains that the policies are aiming toward, right? In terms of improvement, in terms of overall performance on these measures. What's important then is that we know that China dominates in terms of processing a number of rare earth materials and cathodes and this type of area. And so I think doing that in a way in the US is going to require a shift, but it's also going to be done in a way that's going to be it's going to be done in a very a way mindful of the standards in order to do it in a positive way that doesn't have negative impact on the environment.
One of the things that we've noticed recently had to do with the lockdowns that have taken place in China. I saw some numbers that a third of the population is locked down. Do you see that having an effect on the delivery of supplies from your supply base to the manufacturers here in the U.S.?
Without question. I mean, it's not something that, and if we haven't
seen it happen yet?
Not specifically, but it's one of these where we know that there are lagging indicators and lagging effects, and this is certainly something that we've seen over time, historically, and so the lockdowns occur. That disrupts the raw materials to actually make it to the facilities to actually produce components, and then but there's disruption all along the way, and that's the biggest challenge, is that it's not you can't just go and turn the switch back on. It's all along the supply chain, and so it's the raw materials first have to be delivered, then the workforce has to be in the facility, then there have to be think about it on the truck over the shipping or truck routes were derailed, and at the port here in LA and Long Beach, obviously huge implications, not enough drivers. It's multifaceted, obviously.
It's I was wondering if the shutdowns in China and the disruption in the automotive supply chain, because so many components come from China, because of that, would incentivize reshoring or nearshoring.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, we look and you see that, Intel has already, on the semiconductor side, right, is talking about up to $100 billion investment here in Ohio. And so, there are a number of other areas as well, and I think, that's where it's an important aspect too, to leverage and look at, to be, again, the U.S. doesn't want to be an island, right? We don't want to be an island in terms of standards, in terms of policies, but at the same time, we want to make sure that, the U.S. and NAFTA as a whole, that our USMCA is strong, so that we can compete globally. And so that's going to be an important piece here as well.
Right. Anybody have any questions for Mike that I haven't asked?
Hey, Mike, as I think about your membership, I'm probably less concerned about the first tier, but when you look at the second and third tier, how many of them do you think are going to be able to survive this evolution of serving an EV market?
Yeah, it's a good question, but I think it's something that is going to take some time, right? If we look at, this longer term, we know that ICE is going to be around for a long time. And so even within a hybrid environment, hybrid is also a very strong contributor. And so there's tremendous opportunity. It's certainly something that the members, that our members, that all suppliers and stakeholders have to be aware of. If we look at, and what was mentioned earlier, I mean, if we look at, again, Europe, the idea of luxury, if we look at, diesel, as you mentioned, I mean, the idea that shift from diesel to EV is significant. And so that has a very big implications in terms of the kind of workforce that's needed, the number of workers that are needed. And so some very real, areas to address. At the same time, I mean, it's an important one that I think our members are many of our members are really excited and already playing a hand in terms of, contributing to this transition.
Very good. Thanks, Mike.
Thank you.
I think we're going to move on. We've got, wait a minute. I have one other question I wanted to ask you, Mike, that it came up from one of our, and I think this is kind of to the panel as well. What happens to momentum for the EVs and all the things that we been talking about if the Democrats lose the White House in 2024?
Yeah, I guess I'll just make one quick comment. I think, look, it's not different than what happened, policy. I think what's important is any administration recognizes that investments that have already been made are sunk costs. And so it's important to protect those, right? Or else it creates even more disruption. And so I think it's an important one. I don't think and again, as I mentioned, the US doesn't want to be on an island. If the rest of the world globally is pursuing electrification, that's fine. I thought it was interesting that BMW executive Zipse mentioned that it was important to have a balance. So there isn't necessarily a need to say we have to be 100% EV. And so that's an important one there as well. But I'll let some others respond if they have some comments.
Yeah.
I think the midterm elections will be probably more important than the general election almost 2.5 years from now.
Michael?
I was just going to say, I tend to agree with Mike here that, there's a lot of money already being sunk into electric vehicles and manufacturers aren't going to just walk away from those investments.
Yeah. Simon?
Yeah, and I'll just say, I mean, from a climate policy standpoint, obviously, if there's a changeover in Congress or the White House, that slow things down, right? And usually what happens is then states try to pick up their pace, and so there's a give and take there. And I just agree with everyone else that there are drivers here that go beyond climate and regulatory, even though those are really critical. The market competition aspects, investments already made. I mean, the market is, I think everyone's agreeing that the market is going towards that. It's just sort of a question of pace, right?
Yeah. Mike, I guess one last question. If you could get the administration, if the automotive supply base could get the administration to do something to support it, what would it be?
It'd be the CHIPS Act.
Yeah.
Yep. CHIPS Act is absolutely crucial because that alone, right, is going to contribute to higher utilization, of existing facilities. It's going to support, and so it's going to allow manufacturers and suppliers to then fund some of these, a lot of these investments and to move forward in this area.
Yeah. Good. Yeah. And hopefully this may happen after the recess. Let's hope so. Thank you very much, Mike. Next speaker, Robert Charavelli. He's the Strategic Labor CEO of the Strategic Labor and Human Resources. He's recognized for his expertise in the design and execution of strategies in labor and employment relations, compensation and benefits, international HR, alternative dispute resolution, and specialized executive search that improves profitability and workplace effectiveness through people. Prior to founding his consulting and law practice, Bob's unique background included working for Big Labor, the UAW, Solidarity House Research Department, Big Government, National Labor NLRB, and Big Business, Chief Labor and Employment Counsel. Bob received a bachelor's degree in economics from the U of M, a master's degree from Cornell University's Graduate School of Industrial and Labor Relations, and a Juris Doctor from Suffolk University Law School. Bob, labor last but not least. Take it away, Bob.
Thank you very much, Bruce. Before I jump into the presentation, in order to help the audience understand maybe a slight change in perspective, when we look at Biden's policies from the perspective of the first three speakers, you can see that a lot of it is based on economic theory or the need to move technology along. As we look at the administration's impact on labor relations, it's going to be important to look at it through the lens of law theory, social justice theory. Having said that, when I was a young lawyer, I was afraid that all the laws had been established that were going to mark my future in labor law. And my boss said, don't worry, with every presidential change, we will have another set of labor laws for you to practice on. So having said that, the National Labor Relations, I'm going to be focusing on the National Labor Relations Act and its board and the legislation around labor law reform. The National Labor Relations Act for labor lawyers and for labor relations practitioners is really the granddaddy of all labor laws. And with every new administration, because of the structure of how the act provides regulatory guidance, there's oftentimes described a flip-flop in how the law affects business, the labor movement, and workers in general. What I want to start with is, if you want to understand President Biden's agenda, they just recently, that is, the White House just recently published the White House Task Force Report on Worker Organization and Empowerment. Now, the document is a lengthy document, but what I've tried to provide here on this slide are some of the aspirational goals of the Biden administration. And for anybody who's interested in what his agenda might be in terms of policy impact on what companies and unions and governmental agencies will be looking at, you can see a couple things here. One, ensuring workers know what their organizing and bargaining rights are. So we're going to see more in that area. Number two, protecting workers who face any level of retaliation. Now, this whole theory of legal retaliation can be seen in a lot of the regulatory agencies, but here it has a very specific type of impact because it's around workers' rights to organize and to collectively bargain. So even though a lot of the private sector is a non-union private sector, we have been seeing a lot more organizing. Next, they want to establish a resource center for unions and workers around organizing and collective bargaining. They want to educate the next generation of worker. They want to shed light on the employer's use of anti-union consultants. So these are the folks that come in and help companies when they're presented with an organizing campaign of any of the number of unions that might be targeting them. Next, and as we approach the end of this, collecting and reporting more information on unions and their role in the US economy. This is to get that conversation around the dinner table moving in the direction that is more accepting of the labor movement's involvement in the workplace. And lastly, this report talks about advancing equity across underserved communities by supporting the two things that the whole task force is talking about and the Biden administration is pushing: organizing and collective bargaining. Okay, so Biden took a very, very large step within the first month of his presidency, and it really was a bellwether for what he was going to be doing through his executive action. He terminated and replaced the National Labor Relations Board General Counsel. This almost never happens. In the 40 years I've been practicing and the labor history and labor law that I've studied over the years, I have not been able to find one instance where a president has actually not waited for the term of the general counsel to expire. So he came in very quickly, terminated the general counsel that was appointed by President Trump. Number two, he is systematically changing the composition of the board. Now, to give you a little background, the general counsel is in charge of a couple important things: the management of all the regional offices across the country. So when she sets out a policy, all of those offices follow that policy. When there's a dispute, it is decided by a quasi-judicial board called the board, and that composition changes with every president. Next, he is actively encouraging union organizing and the enhancement of worker rights. And of course, he will have a legislative agenda as well, and that's going to be more in the line of progressive labor laws, and we'll talk about that in a second. But before we get there, I want to talk about his appointment to the National Labor Relations Board General Counsel position. Jennifer Abruzzo is a career NLRB person, but she's also acted in a legal, as a general counsel to unions as well. You can see here her party affiliation is Democratic, and she will be in that role until 2025. This is a significant period of time. During the course of this term that she's in, she will decide what issues will be litigated in front of the full board, and ultimately what will be appealed to the highest court of the land. She is, by almost every assessment, an activist general counsel. The board, like every regulatory agency, is given the opportunity to define their own rules, but that process can be very lengthy. General Counsel Abruzzo is taking a much more aggressive stance and informing the regions how she wants to prosecute violations under the National Labor Relations Act. So we're going to see a lot coming through here. For example, if a company violates the National Labor Relations Act, oftentimes there's back pay issues, oftentimes there's liability issues. She's reaching out to extraordinary penalties, for example, having an employer video or film a video that talks about what they've done wrong to be publicized to their employees. So I think the most important aspect of this is we should fully expect that the general counsel will be much more of an activist in the progression of the Biden administration. Now, if we look at the Biden board, this is the quasi-judicial board that decides disputes under the National Labor Relations Act. You'll see in the second column what their party affiliations are. And in almost every case, not every case, but almost every case, when the board votes on it, they vote along party lines. So in this case, 3 out of the 5 board members are from the Democratic Party. And you can see in terms of the end of their terms, they will be here for a significant amount of time. As the cases go through this board, it'll filter up through the appellate courts and through the Supreme Court, and we will see a long-lasting change in the labor laws of the country without any legislation being changed. But there is a Biden agenda for legislation. Now, since I've been practicing labor law, which is many years now, every single year, either a Congress or a president attempts to do some level of labor law reform. I don't know that this opportunity for labor law reform is going to be any more successful than the other ones, but we do know that as long as the House and the Senate have Democratic majorities, there is a better chance for two very important laws to be passed. One is the American Competes Act, and the other one is an act called the PRO Act. They are both, in very certain ways, very, very similar to a law under the Obama administration called the Employee Free Choice Act. And what these laws do, the Compete law and the PRO Act law do, is they emphasize neutrality instead of secret ballot elections. They emphasize determination of majority status of any type of organizing activity based on a card check. They all use binding interest arbitration. Now, in summary, binding interest arbitration is a process where if there is a dispute around the organizing, a panel or a single arbitrator decides what the judgment should be on whatever the dispute was in that organizing campaign. And then lastly, and this is more in the Competes Act, certainly for contractors to the federal government, but also employers that take grants from the federal government, that they pay a prevailing wage. And the prevailing wage is generally based on union wages in a relevant labor market. So what is that impact between the change at the board level and the change in the legislation? One, it's going to define in some very real way and increase the protected and concerted action of employees. Two, employee solicitation and support of unions in workplaces will be more liberalized. Election rules that lead to quick election and less time for employers to campaign against union will be built into the legislation. They have looked at social media differently, and they will protect statements around organizing and labor protections more favorably than it was under the Trump administration. Neutrality agreements will be the preferred way of deciding organizing drives. So instead of using a secret ballot election, they will look for promises by an employer or through the law that requires neutrality on the part of the employer. We already know that there's been an attempt to enforce confidentiality agreements. So oftentimes when there is a dispute in a workplace, as part of a settlement, a non-court settlement, oftentimes there's a pledge on the part of the parties to the agreement not to say anything about it, which cuts off the ability for somebody to say that they've gained a certain financial damage, or that there's some aspect of their employment that, if revealed, would incentivize other people to either sue or be more favorable to the labor movement. And then lastly, joint employer liability will be increased under this new Biden agenda. So now what does this mean in terms of the recent history? Well, here you can see that the percentage of union campaigns for fiscal 2021, and their fiscal year goes October to October, and for the first part of 2022, unions have been winning a very high percentage of organizing drives. If you were to look at this historically, for many years, especially since the Reagan administration, win rates would have been somewhere around 50%. In 2021, that was significantly increased. And if you look at just this most recent fiscal year for the labor board, you can see that the win rate for people who are voting in union elections is significantly higher. So this is the type of impact we will see the Biden administration having on in the labor area. Just to give you a little sense about what a campaign actually looks like, there's a lot here, but I want to point out the aspects of a campaign on the left side are generally done when an organizer does not reveal that they're trying to organize an employer. They're trying to increase support in the membership. The middle part is once the organizing campaign has become known to the employer, that the employer and the union start campaigns that are very much on the surface. The new laws want to really eliminate this ability to campaign for long periods of time on the part of the employer. And I know this is a busy slide, but if anybody is interested in receiving this presentation, I'm glad to send it to them, or Bruce, you can include it in your link. So a couple of years ago, we did a survey and we asked employers how prepared they were for certain types of labor law reform. And these were their responses. They thought unionization would probably increase, and with it, the obligation to negotiate one or more labor agreements. 2, almost everyone that responded said that lack of a bargaining strategy was a mistake. They realized that there's a shortage of labor relations specialists or experts, and it could be costly to the employer if they were targeted and unprepared. Okay, moving to collective bargaining, that's the other aspect that the National Labor Relations Board and the Biden agenda is trying to affect. We have seen very, very large settlements. These are the kind of settlements we haven't seen for 25, 30 years. Based on what's happened in the last 12 months, the median wage has increased overall 4.5%. The average wage about 5.5%. And because the laws of supply and demand, being what they are, unions have been able to roll back contributions that employees make for their health care. So what does this mean? It means that employers should really give some serious thought how they put their compensation structures together. And if they do have a union, what that range of settlements might be. But there are some costly mistakes employers can make if they misread these changes. 1, do they misjudge the settlement range of what collective bargaining settlements might be? In every negotiations, the union and the company come to a last offer. This is almost a term of art, the last, best, and final offer. You can imagine that if you gave a last offer to a union and then they struck, and then you came back and you increased your last offer, going forward, you should expect that they will always push the last offer. So violation of your own last offer, number 1, should be a highly considered opinion. And number 2, the sanctity of it, if you don't want to have to go back and violate every other last offer you make in the future, should be highly considered. And lastly, any strike, anything that interrupts production in the auto industry is going to be a major problem. And so the CEO may say, we want a certain outcome for this negotiations, and if we don't get it, we are willing to press to the wall. We're willing to take a strike. Oftentimes, that should be tempered. Almost always it should be tempered, because the auto industry does not forgive interruptions to production very easily. Okay. This is a striking set of statistics, even for me. When I started looking at the strikes that occurred in the United States in the last couple of years, last year really stood out. Last year, we had 265 large strikes. It covered 140,000 workers. there were 3.2 million strike days. And of those 3.2 million strike days, 35% of those occurred in the manufacturing sector. Surprisingly, 32% of work stoppages were done by non-union workers. And what were the top reasons for that? Pay, healthcare, health and safety, and inadequate staffing. And we might think that these would be located in the industrial heartland, but most of these strikes occurred in the West and the Southeast, and the least of them occurred in the Midwest. Now, to give you a little historical perspective on this, in 1981, President Reagan decided to replace striking workers that strike during the air traffic controller strike. That's PATCO. Prior to that use of replacement workers in 1981, on average, the United States would see about 300 major strikes a year. After 1981, that went down precipitously. After 1981, we averaged around 25 or 30 major strikes a year. What happened in 1981 was the president used a small little portion of the National Labor Relations Act that allowed him to replace striking workers. And after that occurred, employers were emboldened and they did it very, very frequently. And it really calmed down strikes for many years until COVID hit and the Occupy movement hit and the Me Too movement hit and Black Lives Matter hit. And we have seen, even though we're not reaching historic levels in strikes, but an absolute sea change in the willingness of workers and their unions to withhold their services and strike. Okay, so what should you be doing when you see these the Biden administration agenda? One, identify what your vulnerability is. If you're in a high risk, high vulnerability quadrant like we have up here, well, you might want to bring out the 9th Division of the Marines. If, on the other hand, your labor relations and employee relations is good, you're not subject to any bad outcomes if they should occur, well, then you might have a scalable but lesser focus on it. So just straight out of the bag, assess what your vulnerability is for your company. Next, union strategies are sophisticated and long-term. Walter Reuther and the UAW for years developed 50-year strategies. You all in the auto industry may remember that we had guaranteed jobs banks and subpay. Those strategies were created in the mid-50s. So what do I suggest to employers? Develop a risk profile, assess your vulnerability, and if you think you're going to have significant challenges with a union that has organized your workforce or that may target your company, understand who those unions are and what the issues your employees might have. Next, understand card check and neutrality. Educate yourself on the board processes and the proposed laws and what's happening in your industry. I have to say, the OESA is great for helping employers understand these very complicated matters. And I think I'm just about to the end here. Take what we've presented to you on the Biden agenda. We know that some of it's aspirational, but we also know that there will be compromised bills. Be part of the debate. OESA is a wonderful place to do that. Develop a legislative agenda. So, what are the 8 things that I would suggest you do short and midterm? Stay current on legislative developments, conduct vulnerability assessments and satisfaction surveys of your workforce, document your business plans to avoid penalties and injunctions, implement best practices, train your supervisors. They are where the rubber hits the road, and when they're not trained, it just makes life a little more difficult for the companies. Train and orient your employees. And lastly, secure your property and people. Communicate and celebrate with your employees. I'll leave that up. If anybody needs this presentation, I am glad to provide it to them. Thank you, Bruce.
Thanks, Bob. I got some questions for you. Well, we all here know the history of the auto industry and its unionizations. And we also know about its lack of unionization in the South. Bob, I guess the question comes to you to start out with. Do you see the potential for labor unions making inroads in the southern parts of the United States over the next 5 to 10 years? And the follow-up question was, does the president have any leverage to support this?
Okay, so we know that as you go down the eastern seaboard to the Kentuckys, the Tennessees, the Alabamas of the world, and across over to Texas, and then up towards California, there has been a movement of industry. And the movement has been based, I think, in large part on site selection consultants who have said there's fewer unions down here. In large part, unions have not been successful down there. And if they continue to organize the way they have been for many years, I don't see there being much of a future for them to increase their members. When I worked at the research department of the UAW in 1978, the UAW had 1.2 million members. The last report of the UAW, they were under 400,000 members. And they have only increased by dribs and drabs. Now, what I will tell you, where there is a different way to organize your members, and there will be innovation in this area, there will be opportunities for unions to win organizing drives. And to point that out well, Amazon lost a union election in New York City just recently. And there was no name brand union that was organizing for them. It was absolutely grassroots. And the questions and the approaches that the organizers used were tremendously effective. If Amazon can be a target of a union organizing drive and lose, then certainly the automotive manufacturers, whether they're the OEMs or suppliers, can have that fate as well. But it is going to be a very, very uphill battle between now and the next 5 years.
Now, Bob, you mentioned earlier about the issues of shortening the time between the time you do probably a card check and by the time you have a vote, so management cannot use that time to bring in consultants and work the room, so to speak. Does that have to be a change in laws, or is that something that the administration can or the National Labor Relations Board can make a change to? Okay,
that is a fabulous question. So we know that the president can use the bully pulpit. We know he can put forward a legislative agenda that changes the law. We know that the National Labor Relations Board can do rulemaking. Those three things I've just mentioned are very, very difficult to do, and they take a lot of time. When he appointed Jennifer Abruzzo as general counsel, she has already advised the regions across the country that they will start to prosecute employer campaigns that are called captive audience speeches. This is where a company, as part of their campaign, will require employees to listen to their campaign communications. And under the Abruzzo General Counsel regime, that will most probably become illegal. So to answer your question specifically, even though the bully pulpit won't work real well or quickly, even though the legislative approach won't, even though the rulemaking approach won't for the regulatory agency, the general counsel is using her authority to now make those litigatable offenses.
Very good. Michael or Mike, do you guys have any questions for Bob? No.
I guess one, Bruce, my question, the shift toward electrification obviously would require reskilling. And so, within, I don't know if there's any kind of position relative to, we see that some emerging, OEs are a bit more vertically integrated. Just curious if there's any, kind of takeaways there.
So the research department about a year ago, out of the UAW research department, published a study on the impact electrification will do to permanent job loss. And it's really quite significant. There have been estimates that each one of the companies, just in their powertrain plants alone, will lose up to 20,000 permanent jobs. And what they are talking about in that paper, and many people think make a lot of sense, is to go slow on electrification. There's one set of people that say, provide enough grants, provide enough financial incentives, and the business will develop new opportunities that will increase employment. But the way the UAW sees it, and most of the labor movement sees it, is it will be a very, very difficult and lengthy transition where people are going to lose jobs. And secondly, in a more objective way, saying we don't have the skills today, whether it's mechatronics or some other aspect, for large numbers of workers, engineers, technicians, to do the kinds of things required to make electrification a reality sooner. I think you mentioned, and I agree with you 100%, Mike, that there are many, many more good jobs than there are employees to fill them. And people are going to be battling for that talent. And if the OEMs battle for the talent, it gets sucked straight out of the supply chain.
Yeah, very good. Very good, Bob. Yeah, I think you made some very strong points about how this might play out in the short term and in probably over the next 5 to 10 years.
Yeah, and the other thing, Bruce, they don't make labor lawyers anymore. People don't go to law school to become a labor lawyer anymore. And as you look at the people out there, most of the people in business can muddle through this stuff. But when you make a mistake in this area, it is something that lasts for a very long time. If you have a union, you don't decertify a union. If you have bad employee relations, you don't change that morale overnight. So the implications of doing this stuff badly are not always understood, even though we can still muddle through them as best we can.
Mm-hmm. When you've looked at historically, Bob, when you've looked at how the unions approached, and I'm thinking particularly about the Japanese manufacturers, how they've approached the Japanese and have been pretty unsuccessful in organizing those manufacturers. Is there something that the unions are doing wrong in terms of how they approach Japanese plants?
Yes, I do believe that to be the case. what they've done right in the transplants case, whether it's an OEM or a supplier, they've now created regional offices in those relevant labor markets. So they're learning. But they're using 1950 and 60 style organizing methods for a millennial or Gen X workforce. And the other thing is, if you look at successful employers, the ones that are very productive, they have good employee relations, they don't do labor relations the way they used to. You know, in the old days, labor relations was a lot of labor law, a lot of hand pounding on tables. Today, those companies have a lot of still technical labor law being done. They have solid labor relations people. They understand the industry. They understand what's happening, but they do engagement and strategic communications very, very well. We are being forced in America to treat our workforce differently today because we're on the wrong side of the supply and demand. We have all these great jobs and we need to put people into them. And that supply and demand equation has made employers look at how they treat their employers differently in ways we haven't had to for the last 30 years. So to be in summary, you're not going to organize these workers the way you did in the past. You're going to organize them in the way the Occupy movement brought hundreds of thousands of people together, or the Me Too movement. And those were all non-traditional grassroots efforts.
Very good. Thank you very much, Bob. Very good presentation. Good insight. Michael and Mike, thank you also for the work you put in on your presentations and the insight you gave our panels, our attendees to the issues related to our topic. I'm going to call it and say thank you to you and to everybody who attended. We also have again, as usual, thanking our affiliates for their support. Their next conference is going to be July 13th and 14th, the 14th annual Propulsion Strategies for the 21st Century. Again, thank you to our speakers. The presentations will be up and the video will be up on the website this weekend. Again, thank you to you all and have a good day.